Hey guys, tonight we are treading softly into the ancient olive groves and sacred precincts of classical Greece, not to witness epic battles or ponder profound philosophies, but to explore something far more intimate, more primal, and often to our modern eyes, rather wonderfully strange. We're going to delve into the curious and deeply earnest rituals the ancient Greeks performed to seek blessings of fertility for their lands, for their livestock, and for their families. Imagine yourself on a quiet hillside as dusk settles the air, fragrant with wild thyme and the distant bleating of goats. Before a rustic, unassuming shrine, a small group of figures moves in a pattern as old as the stones themselves. They're whispered incantations seeking to coax life and abundance from the very earth and from the often capricious gods. This isn't a Sunday school picnic. These are ancient rites born from a profound understanding of life's fragility and a desperate hope for its continuation. And honestly, if you were suddenly thrust into one of these rituals with its sometimes bizarre ingredients, we'll get to those. It's unfamiliar chants, and it's deeply symbolic and occasionally rather public, and shall we say anatomically specific gestures. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer cultural whiplash and the intense social pressure to participate with appropriate solemnity without at least dissolving into a fit of nervous giggles or accidentally offending a minor but surprisingly touchy earth deity with a poorly timed sneeze. It was serious business. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a gentle comfort to know our global community of history enthusiasts and sleepy scholars is gathered together, ready for another quiet drift into the past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself now in ancient Greece not as a tourist with a camera and a guidebook, but as someone living within that world, perhaps in a sun-drenched agricultural valley in Attica or a remote wind-scoured island village in the Aegean. The time is somewhere in the classical period, let's say around the 5th or 4th century BCE. Though many of the beliefs and practices we'll touch upon have roots that stretch much further back into the mists of the Bronze Age and even earlier. The world around you is both breathtakingly beautiful. The clear Mediterranean light, the rugged mountains, the sparkling sea, and often quite precarious. The success of your olive harvest. The yield of your precious barley fields, the health of your new lambs and kids, and most crucially for the continuation of your family line and the honoring of your ancestors, the birth of healthy children. These are not abstract concerns or casual hopes. They are matters of profound everyday importance. They dictate survival, prosperity, and your very place within the community and the cosmos. Fertility in its broadest sense, encompassing the fruitfulness of the earth that feeds you, the fecundity of the animals that sustain you, and the procreation of humankind that ensures your lineage endures, was an absolute central preoccupation in ancient Greek religion and daily life. It's no exaggeration to say that a vast and varied array of their rituals, their grand public festivals, their private prayers, and their most earnest offerings were dedicated to the numerous gods and goddesses who were believed to hold sway over these essential life-giving and sometimes frustratingly elusive aspects of existence. Barrenness, whether it struck your fields, your flocks, or your family, was seen not merely as a personal misfortune or an economic setback. It was often interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a curse from an angered deity, a disruption in the natural and cosmic order that needed to be addressed, appeased, and rectified through careful ritual action. It could bring shame upon a household, lead to economic ruin for a farming community, and even threaten the continuity and strength of the oikos, the fundamental family unit and household, and by extension the police, the city-state itself, which relied on a steady supply of future citizens and soldiers. Therefore, ensuring fertility, actively encouraging it, coaxing it forth from the reluctant earth or the hesitant womb, was a constant, vital, and deeply serious endeavor. It wasn't something you could just leave to chance or a vaguely optimistic attitude. You couldn't simply fill out a divine request form for Fertility Blessing number 34B subsection, twins preferably male, and hope for the best. It required a much more hands-on and often rather messy and time-consuming approach to divine communication and sacred negotiation. The ancient Greeks, for all their later contributions to philosophy, mathematics, and what we now call science, lived in a world that was still profoundly enchanted, a world where the divine was an immanent, active presence in every aspect of life. They didn't have our modern scientific explanations for genetics, for soil chemistry, or for reproductive biology. Their understanding was framed by myth, by tradition, and by a deep, if not always gentle, relationship with the often unpredictable forces of nature. So their methods for seeking fertility blessings were rooted in this worldview, involving practices that might strike our modern sensibilities as decidedly peculiar, perhaps even wonderfully strange, or at times a little unsettling. Some of their rituals for encouraging a bumper crop of figs or ensuring the arrival of a healthy heir might make a contemporary organic farmer, for all their own reverence for Mother Earth, raise a very surprised eyebrow and possibly suggest a long, quiet chat with a specialist for the fig tree in question, or maybe just a stronger fence. When we use the word strange to describe these rituals, it's important to approach it with a sense of gentle, sleepy curiosity, not with judgment or mockery. What seems bizarre or even shocking to us today, viewed across the chasm of millennia and through the lens of our own cultural norms, was for the ancient Greeks a perfectly logical, deeply meaningful, and often profoundly sacred way of engaging with the divine powers they believed governed their lives. Their rituals were a complex language, an expression of their deepest hopes for abundance, their profound fears of scarcity and oblivion, and their earnest understanding of how the cosmos worked. The strange is very often just the unfamiliar, shaped by a different set of assumptions about cause and effect, about the relationship between humanity and the gods, about what it took to keep the great cycle of life turning. We have our own complex rituals for ensuring well-being. Think of our elaborate exercise routines, our supplement regimens, our sometimes obsessive pursuit of wellness. Are they truly any less strange to an outside observer from a completely different time and culture? Perhaps not. These fertility-seeking practices were not confined to obscure hidden cults or the esoteric knowledge of a few priests or priestesses, though specialized rituals certainly existed. Concerns about fertility in one form or another permeated every level of society and every aspect of daily life. The farmer, anxiously watching his barley shoots emerge from the dry earth, would offer a prayer to Demeter. The shepherd, hoping for healthy new lambs, would leave a token for Pan or Hermes in a rustic shrine. The young couple, newly married and yearning for children to continue their lineage and care for them in their old age, would make offerings at the temple of Hera or Aphrodite. Grand public festivals like the Thesmophoria, which we'll explore later, involved the entire community of women in rites designed to ensure the fertility of both the land and their own bodies. Fertility was a constant shared preoccupation, a thread woven through the very fabric of ancient Greek existence. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise origins and the full symbolic meanings of many early Greek fertility symbols and ritual practices. Particularly intriguing are questions about whether certain primitive-seeming rituals, perhaps involving crude representations of generative organs, the ritual use of potent natural substances, or somewhat earthy, uninhibited behaviors during certain festivals, were direct survivals from much older, pre-Hellenic Neolithic or Bronze Age cultures, with their own powerful earth goddesses and nature cults. Or if these practices developed more independently within the specific agricultural, social, and evolving religious contexts of the different Greek polis city-states as they emerged. The layers of meaning are often as deep and as ancient as the very soil they so desperately sought to make fruitful, a rich compost of belief, tradition, and the enduring human hope for life's continuation. Our journey tonight is to gently sift through some of these layers to try and catch the sacred whispers from those ancient wombs and fertile fields. Okay, I understand you'd like Section 2 of the script for strange ancient Greek rituals for fertility blessings. I will write this section according to the outline and all the specified rules, aiming for the 1,300 to 1,400 word count. Here is Section 2. Section 2, you're now standing in that ancient Greek landscape, the scent of wild thyme and sun-baked earth in the air. Your mind open to exploring the often strange and deeply earnest ways these people sought the vital blessings of fertility. You understand that for them, the continuation of life in their fields, their flocks, and their families was not a given, but a precious gift often perceived as being in the hands of divine powers. So, before we delve into the specific rituals themselves, some of which might seem wonderfully perplexing or even a tad alarming, To our modern sensibilities, it's essential to acquaint ourselves with the divine cast of characters, the Olympian and chthonic deities to whom the ancient Greeks turned with their hopes and pleas. This wasn't a simple matter of petitioning one specialized minister for bountiful babies and bumper barley. Oh no. The Greek pantheon, in its glorious and sometimes confusing complexity, had a whole department of divine specialists, a veritable celestial committee, each with their own particular influence, their own unique portfolio over the various crucial facets of life's incredible and sometimes frustratingly elusive power of growth and renewal. At the very forefront of agricultural fertility, the one whose moods, myths, and sacred mysteries could literally mean feast or famine for entire communities, was the great Earth Mother goddess Demeter. She was one of the 12 Olympians, sister of Zeus, and she was the revered goddess of the grain, particularly wheat and barley, the staples of the Greek diet, of the harvest of cultivated land, and of the sacred laws and cycles of life, death, and regeneration that governed the earth's bounty. When Demeter was happy and her daughter Persephone was by her side, the fields would be golden with ripe wheat. The olive trees would droop heavy with fruit, and the vineyards would burst with sweet grapes ready for the treading. But when Demeter was grieving or angered, as she was during her desperate search for Persephone, after Hades abducted her to the underworld, the earth itself would become barren and cold, a stark, chilling reminder of her immense power over all life and sustenance. So keeping Demeter content through regular offerings, heartfelt prayers, and elaborate, often joyous agricultural festivals, like the Proorosia before plowing or the Hallow Threshing Festival, was absolutely paramount for any farming community. You really didn't want to get on the wrong side of the goddess, who essentially controlled your entire carbohydrate supply and your access to a decent loaf of bread. Her moods directly impacted the gluten market. Closely intertwined with Demeter, and often worshipped alongside her in what was known as the Two Goddesses cult, was her beloved daughter Persephone, also called Kor, meaning simply the maiden. Persephone's dramatic story, her abduction by Hades, lord of the underworld, and her eventual negotiated return to the world of the living for part of each year, was the very mythological explanation for the cycle of the seasons, the death of vegetation in the autumn and winter when she resided below, and its joyful rebirth in the spring and summer when she returned to her mother. Together, Demeter and Kor represented the unending mystical process of growth, decay, and miraculous regeneration that underpinned all agricultural life. Their most famous and secretive cult, the Eleusinian Mysteries, held annually at Eleusis near Athens, promised initiates not just a better harvest in this life, but also, it was believed, a more blessed and hopeful afterlife, directly linking earthly fertility to spiritual salvation and the continuity of the soul. Then, of course, there was the irrepressible Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstatic revelry, and the untamed, wildly proliferating life force of nature. While he's often remembered for his rather boisterous festivals involving a good deal of wine-fueled dancing, dramatic performances, and general uninhibited merriment, the original party animal deity, if you will, Dionysus was also a profoundly important fertility god. His domain included not just the fruitfulness of the grapevine, but also the general fecundity of the earth, the rising sap in trees, the blossoming of wildflowers, and that kind of wild, untamed, slightly dangerous vegetative power that just erupts with unstoppable force in the springtime. His festivals, such as the rural Dionysia or the Anthesteria, a spring flower festival that also had a more somber aspect connected to the dead, often involved rather uninhibited celebrations. The prominent display of phallic symbols, which we'll get to in a moment. Hold your horses, or rather your satyrs, and rituals designed to awaken the dormant fertility of the earth, and by extension its human and animal inhabitants. He wasn't so much about the orderly, neatly plowed fields that Demeter favored. Dionysus was more about the raw, untamed, slightly intoxicating, and wonderfully chaotic vegetative power that just explodes with life. If Demeter was the careful, nurturing head gardener, ensuring a steady supply of sensible grains, Dionysus was the life-of-the-party guest horticulturalist who might accidentally encourage a few too many weeds to grow alongside the prize-winning roses, but would also somehow make your ancient Greek orchids bloom like they'd never bloomed before, all while leading a conga line of slightly tipsy maenads. He wasn't just bringing the wine to the divine potluck. He was also ensuring there'd be enough grapes to make the wine for next year's even wilder and more agriculturally stimulating party. Very forward-thinking in his own unique, ecstatic way, for specifically human procreation, several other major deities held significant sway. Hera, as the august queen of the gods, the long-suffering but powerful wife of the notoriously philandering Zeus, was the preeminent goddess of marriage women and legitimate childbirth. She was invoked as Hera Telea, Hera the fulfiller of marriage vows and unions, and couples hoping to start a family would offer her earnest prayers and sacrifices for a fruitful marriage and healthy, legitimate offspring to continue the family line and inherit the ancestral property. She was a powerful, if sometimes rather jealous and vengeful, especially where Zeus's, his many extracurricular divine liaisons were concerned. Protectress of the sanctity of the marital bed and the legitimacy of heirs. Keeping Hera happy and feeling respected was absolutely key for a peaceful home and a full nursery. You did not want to be on her bad side if you were hoping for legitimate heirs to carry on the family name. Just ask any of Zeus's numerous and often tragically transformed paramours. Naturally, Aphrodite, the dazzling foam-born goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, desire, and procreation also played a hugely significant role in all matters of fertility. While her domain often focused on the intoxicating power of erotic love and irresistible physical attraction, these were of course generally considered rather essential precursors to the conception of new life in the ancient world and indeed in our own. Offerings of sweet wine, fragrant incense, myrtle branches, or perhaps small, beautifully crafted votive doves would be made to her by those seeking success in love, a desirable and fertile partner, and the ultimate blessing of children born from that passionate union. Her influence was all about the spark, the desire, the irresistible cosmic pull that led to new beginnings and the continuation of the human race. She was the divine matchmaker, the ultimate celestial wingwoman, and the powerful patroness of making lots of little Greeks to eventually grow up and make more offerings. And we cannot forget Artemis, the eternally virgin huntress twin sister of the radiant Apollo goddess of the wilderness, wild animals, the moon. And in a way that might seem wonderfully paradoxical to our modern minds, a crucial protectress of women in childbirth and of newborn infants and young children. She was often invoked by women in labor under epithets like Artemis Lochia, Artemis of childbirth, to ensure a safe and swift delivery and the health of the infant. Her own wild, untamed, fiercely independent nature perhaps connected her to the primal, powerful, and often perilous forces of birth, and her role as a guardian of the young, both animal and human, made her a vital ally in those vulnerable early stages of life. In some perhaps more rustic or very localized Greek communities, there were also highly specialized, often less grand nymphs of the fields or spirits of the plowed earth, who might receive very specific humble offerings, perhaps the very first handful of seed from a farmer's bag before planting began, or a quiet libation of milk or honey poured directly onto the soil of a newly tilled field, all to ensure the particular micro-fertility and cooperation of a specific plot of land. It was like having a very hyper-local, highly specialized divine agricultural consultant assigned to each individual farm or even each field, ensuring every clod of earth felt appropriately respected and divinely motivated. The precise hierarchy and the degree of overlapping, or sometimes even competing functions among these various Greek fertility deities, and how these complex divine relationships were understood or prioritized by worshippers in different regions. Attica versus Sparta, for instance, or across different social strata, such as the grand state cults in the cities versus more private traditional household worship in rural areas, remain wonderfully complex and occasionally quite tangled areas of ongoing study and gentle debate for classicists and historians of ancient religion. This divine pantheon, with its sometimes overlapping and occasionally complementary domains, provided the ancient Greeks with a comprehensive spiritual framework for understanding and, more importantly, for seeking to actively influence the profound, essential, and often deeply mysterious forces of fertility that governed their world from the sprouting of a single barley corn to the birth of a healthy child. Each god and goddess required their own specific forms of address, their own particular offerings, their own unique and sometimes rather strange rituals if their precious blessings of abundance were to be successfully coaxed forth for the benefit of the land, the livestock, and the all-important continuation of the human family. You are now well acquainted with the divine roster of ancient Greek deities who held sway over the crucial domains of fertility, from Demeter, the solemn Earth Mother, who ensured your barley fields ripened, to Dionysus, the wild god of ecstatic growth and intoxicating vine fruit, and Aphrodite, who fanned the flames of desire that led to new generations. Each had their sphere of influence, their preferred offerings, their unique festivals. But among all the myriad cults and rituals dedicated to ensuring life's continuation, one stood out for its profound antiquity, its closely guarded secrets, and its deeply resonant promise of not just earthly abundance, but also a blessed afterlife the Eleusinian mysteries celebrated in honor of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. To journey as an initiate to Eleusis was to seek a glimpse into the very heart of life, death, and rebirth, and to emerge with a hope that transcended the cycles of the agricultural year. Imagine yourself an ancient Greek from Athens, or perhaps even a more distant Polis, having made the momentous decision to seek initiation into these revered mysteries. The main rites, the greater mysteries, were held annually in the early autumn, around September or October, coinciding with the autumn sowing of the grain, a time of hope and anxiety for the coming agricultural year. The sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Eleusis, a small town about 14 miles west of Athens, was one of the most sacred sites in the entire Greek world. For nearly 2,000 years, from the Mycenaean period down to the Roman Emperor Theodosius's edict closing pagan temples in 392 CE, these mysteries drew initiates from all corners of the Hellenic world and beyond. The Eleusinian mysteries were indeed one of the most important and enduring religious cults of ancient Greece, centered at Eleusis and dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. They involved secret initiation rites that promised to participants not just agricultural prosperity, but also a form of salvation, a happier lot in the afterlife, and a deeper understanding of the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, directly linking the fertility of the earth with the spiritual renewal of the individual. The mythic foundation of the mysteries, as you'll recall, is the heart-wrenching story of Demeter's search for her beloved daughter Persephone, who was abducted by Hades, the grim lord of the underworld, and taken below to be his queen. Demeter, in her profound grief and rage, caused the earth to become barren. No crops would grow, no life would flourish until her daughter was returned. Eventually, Zeus intervened, and a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year with her husband Hades in the underworld, corresponding to the fallow winter season, when seeds lie dormant beneath the earth, and part of the year with her mother Demeter. In the world above, corresponding to the spring and summer, the seasons of growth and harvest. This powerful myth not only explained the changing seasons and the miracle of agricultural renewal, but also offered a profound metaphor for the human soul's journey through life, death, and the hope of some form of continued existence or rebirth. The initiation into the greater mysteries was a complex multi-day affair. It began in Athens with purification rites, sacrifices, and a general atmosphere of sacred anticipation. Then came one of its most famous elements, the grand procession from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way. Imagine yourself part of this throng of initiates mystai, dressed perhaps in simple white garments, carrying bundles of myrtle or sheaves of barley. The journey itself was a ritual, a symbolic movement from the profane world of the city to the sacred space of the sanctuary. It was a long walk, punctuated by specific stops rituals and traditional jests. And there's a rather quirky and well-documented tidbit about this procession. As the initiates crossed a bridge over the Cephisus River, they would encounter figures, perhaps priests or cult officials, sometimes masked, who would engage in gephorismos, a ritualized shouting of insults, mockery, and often quite bawdy or abusive language directed at the passing initiates, particularly prominent or wealthy ones. This seemingly bizarre practice, this bridge jesting, was thought by some to perhaps ward off evil spirits or the evil eye by deflecting envy to induce a state of humility before the sacred rites, or even to provide a moment of cathartic licensed release and laughter before the solemnities that lay ahead at Eleusis. It's like a divine roast, but for your soul, expertly delivered just before you get to the really serious, deeply spiritual part of the ancient Greek self-help retreat. You'd probably want to make sure your toga was securely fastened and your sense of humor was firmly in place for that particular river crossing. Once at Eleusis, the initiates would undergo further purifications, perhaps bathing in the sea, and would likely fast or observe specific dietary restrictions. They would then enter the sacred precinct and eventually the telesterion, the great windowless initiation hall, one of the largest enclosed structures in ancient Greece, capable of holding thousands of people. And it is here within the dimly lit, incense-filled, and emotionally charged atmosphere of the telesterion that the core secret rites of the Eleusinian mysteries took place. What exactly happened inside was and largely remains a profound secret. Initiates were bound by an unbreakable oath, punishable by death, never to reveal what they had seen, heard, or experienced during the culmination of the mysteries. The first rule of Eleusinian Mysteries Club. You do not talk about Eleusinian Mysteries Club. The second rule, seriously don't even think about dropping hints on your ancient Greek equivalent of a social media feed or Demeter will turn your prize-winning olive grove into a parking lot for Hades' chariot. And probably ensure your next barley harvest consists entirely of very small, very disappointed pebbles. Despite this profound secrecy, ancient writers have left us a few tantalizing, if veiled, clues. The rites seem to have involved three main components. The dromina, the things done, perhaps a dramatic reenactment of parts of the Demeter and Persephone myth, a sacred pageant of loss, searching and joyful reunion. The legomena, the things said, sacred utterances, chants, or pronouncements by the Hierophant, the chief priest who revealed the sacred objects. And the diagnimena, the things shown, the climactic revelation of sacred objects. What were these sacred objects? We don't know for sure. Some scholars speculate it might have been something as simple yet profoundly symbolic as a freshly cut ear of grain representing the miracle of life and rebirth from the earth. Another key element was likely the partaking of a sacred drink called the kykeon. This was a mixture of barley meal water and pennyroyal, a type of mint. The precise nature of the culminating beatific vision or revelatory experience within the telesterion at Eleusis, whether it was induced primarily by the powerful emotional impact of the ritual drama and the sacred objects shown the psychological effects of the fasting. The long procession and the intense group atmosphere, the possible though highly debated psychoactive properties of the kykeon drink. Some suggest the pennyroyal or perhaps an ergot fungus sometimes found on barley could have had hallucinogenic effects, or a profound combination of all these elements, remains one of the most enduring and tantalizing mysteries of ancient Greek religion. What was in that kykeon drink to make it so memorable, barley water mint? And perhaps just a little something extra from Demeter's private divine herb garden to make those ears of grain look really, really cosmically significant and full of promise for a happy afterlife. What is clear from the testimony of initiates like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and various Roman emperors who were initiated is that the experience was profoundly moving and transformative. It did not necessarily reveal specific doctrines or a complex theology, but rather offered a powerful emotional and spiritual insight, a vision that removed the fear of death and promised a happier existence in the afterlife, alongside a deeper appreciation for the cycles of nature and the gift of agricultural fertility in this life. Promising a happy afterlife alongside a good harvest was a pretty compelling recruitment tool for any ancient religion, better than just free grain samples after the service. Though that was probably also quite appreciated by the attendees. The Eleusinian mysteries, with their fertile promise of life's eternal renewal, held a unique and deeply cherished place in the hearts and minds of the ancient Greeks for nearly 2 millennia. You've just had a tantalizing, if necessarily veiled, glimpse into the profound Eleusinian mysteries, those sacred rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone that promised initiates not just earthly abundance, but also a blessed passage into the afterlife, linking the fertility of the grain with the eternal renewal of the human spirit. The profound secrecy surrounding the core rituals at Eleusis means much remains shrouded in an alluring, almost sacred darkness. But Demeter and Persephone were also honored in other equally ancient and perhaps even more widespread festivals that were absolutely vital for ensuring the fertility of the land. And one of the most important, most intriguing, and to our modern sensibilities, perhaps one of the strangest of these was the Thesmophoria, a women-only festival, a secret world of feminine ritual, earthy magic, and practices that might make you wrinkle your nose a little, but were all performed with utmost seriousness and profound religious intent. Imagine now it's autumn in ancient Greece, likely in the month of Paenepsion, which corresponds roughly to our October or November. This is the crucial time for sowing the grain, the moment when the seeds are entrusted to the earth in the hope of a bountiful spring harvest. And it is at this pivotal point in the agricultural calendar that the Thesmophoria was celebrated by citizen women, and only by citizen women of good standing, in many Greek city-states, most famously in Athens. Men were strictly excluded. This was sacred women's business, a time for them to connect directly with the generative powers of the earth and the divine feminine embodied by Demeter Thesmophoros, Demeter the lawbringer or bringer of custom. in her role as the goddess who established the laws of agriculture and civilized life, and her daughter, Persephone, queen of the underworld. The Thesmophoria was an ancient Greek religious festival celebrated exclusively by these married citizen women, primarily intended to promote the fertility of the newly sown grain and, by extension, human fecundity, ensuring the continuation of both the crops and the community. The festival typically lasted for 3 days, though variations existed. The first day, the Anodod, or ascent, saw the women processing to a special, often secluded sanctuary, the Thesmophorion, which might be located on a hillside within a temple precinct, or even just a designated outdoor space. Here they would set up temporary shelters or huts made of green branches, creating a kind of exclusive, all-female sacred campout where they would live for the duration of the festival, separated from their husbands and the everyday concerns of their households. It was a retreat, a time for female solidarity, purification, and focused ritual activity. No boys allowed. Not even if they brought really good honey cakes, or promised not to listen in on the sacred and possibly rather spicy girl talk about Demeter Persephone, and perhaps the general shortcomings of husbands when it came to properly appreciating the mysteries of agriculture. The second day, the Nestia, or fasting, was a period of solemnity, purification, and, as the name suggests, abstention from food. The women would sit on the ground, perhaps on mats of reeds, engaging in rituals of mourning for Persephone's descent into the underworld, thereby acknowledging the death of the seed as it was planted in the earth, a necessary precursor to its rebirth as new grain. This day was also characterized by astrologia, ritualized abusive language mockery, or obscene jesting. This might seem utterly counterintuitive for a solemn religious occasion, but this practice, found in various ancient Greek cults, was thought to have apotropaic power, warding off evil spirits or bad luck, or perhaps to induce a kind of catharsis, or even through the shock of taboo breaking and laughter, to magically stimulate fertility. The exact symbolic meaning and ritual function of the astrologia during the Thesmophoria continue to be explored and debated by classicists and scholars of Greek religion. It was probably the one time of year when respectable Greek matrons could really let loose with some choice words about their neighbors, their husbands, or even the gods themselves, all in the name of ensuring a good harvest. That lazy farmer Theron down the road, his barley is as sparse as his wits, and his prize bull has the romantic inclinations of a particularly uninspired paving stone. All for Demeter, of course, and for the good of the crops. But it is the third day that Kalligeneia, or fair birth, or perhaps beautiful offspring, that contained some of the most distinctive and, to us, perhaps strangest rituals involving the retrieval of unspeakable things errata from sacred pits or chasms known as megara. Earlier in the year, perhaps at another festival, like the Skira, young piglets sucking pigs would have been thrown into these subterranean chambers, along with other items, possibly including pine cones, symbols of fertility and dough or clay models shaped like serpents, or yes, human genitalia, very direct symbols of procreative power. By the time of the Thesmophoria, these offerings would have decayed into a rich, potent, and undoubtedly rather fragrant organic compost. A central and distinctive ritual of the Thesmophoria involved specially purified women known as antlitriae balers, or drawers up, descending into these pits to retrieve the putrefied remains of the piglets and these other symbolic items. Not exactly a trip to your local organic garden center for a bag of sterilized potting mix. Right then, ladies who's on piglet chasm duty this year, don't forget your sturdiest wicker basket, your nose plugs, and your most unwavering nerves. It's all for the good of the grain. These retrieved decomposed remains, this powerful compost of death and regeneration, were then brought up, placed on altars sacred to Demeter and Persephone, and crucially mixed with the seed corn that was about to be sown in the fields. This was a potent act of sympathetic magic, a direct transference of the concentrated fertility of these decayed offerings into the new seeds, ensuring they would sprout, grow strong, and yield an abundant harvest. It was a very earthy, very direct way of participating in the cycle of life-death and rebirth, acknowledging that from decay comes new life, a core tenet of Demeter's mysteries. Imagine trying to explain this particular agricultural technique to your local modern council when applying for a festival permit. Yes, your worship, our autumn planting festival involves the ritual retrieval of, shall we say, well-matured porcine organic matter from a sacred pit, which we then lovingly combine with our seed grain. It's for the good of the community's allotment gardens, you see, and Demeter herself highly recommends it. We've got pamphlets, This focus on the below, on the chthonic, on the mysteries of the earth, and its regenerative powers made the Thesmophoria a profoundly powerful and uniquely feminine ritual. It acknowledged and celebrated women's crucial roles in both agricultural and human reproduction, linking the fertility of their bodies with the fertility of the land they helped to sustain. The strange, earthy, and deeply sacred rites of the Thesmophoria were a vital thread in the rich tapestry of ancient Greek efforts to ensure that life in all its forms would continue to bless their world. You have just witnessed the rather earthy and exclusively feminine mysteries of the Thesmophoria, where ancient Greek women engaged in secret rites involving decaying piglets and symbolic dough offerings to ensure the fertility of the newly sown grain, all under the watchful eyes of Demeter and Persephone. These rituals, grounded in the cycles of decay and regeneration, speak to a profound understanding of the earth's power. But the ancient Greek quest for fertility blessings wasn't always so solemn, or so singularly focused on the orderly cultivation of Demeter's life-giving grain. There was another altogether wilder, more ecstatic, and often more publicly uninhibited divine force they turned to when seeking to awaken the raw, untamed, and irrepressible fecundity of nature, the god Dionysus. His rites, rich with wine music and a kind of sacred madness, promised not just a good grape harvest, but a surge of vital, procreative energy through the land and its people. Dionysus, often depicted as a youthful, somewhat androgynous god crowned with ivy or vine leaves, perhaps carrying a thyrsus, a fennel stalk tipped with a pine cone and wreathed in ivy, and frequently accompanied by his entourage of ecstatic female devotees. The Maenads and mischievous goat-like satyrs is popularly known as the god of wine revelry and the theater which originated in his festivals. But his domain extended far beyond just a good party or an engaging dramatic performance. The worship of Dionysus in ancient Greece was characterized by these ecstatic rituals, joyous processions often featuring those rather prominent phallic symbols we'll soon explore in more detail, dramatic festivals that were the very birthplace of Greek theater. And of course, the ritualized consumption of wine, all aimed at celebrating and invoking his powerful influence over natural fertility, particularly that of the grapevine, and more broadly, the unbridled, often chaotic, life force inherent in all of nature. He was the god of the sap rising in the trees in spring, the intoxicating perfume of blooming flowers, the untamed growth in the wilderness, and the generative procreative urge in both animals and humans. If Demeter represented the ordered, cultivated fertility of the plowed field, Dionysus embodied the wild, spontaneous, and sometimes overwhelming fertility of the untouched forest or the vigorously sprouting vine. He wasn't just bringing the wine to the divine annual potluck, he was also vigorously ensuring there'd be enough grapes to make even more wine for next year's even wilder, more agriculturally stimulating, and very well lubricated party. A very forward-thinking deity in his own uniquely chaotic and effervescent way. His festivals, which punctuated the Greek religious calendar, were often times of licensed abandon moments, when the ordinary rules and constraints of society were temporarily suspended, allowing for a collective outpouring of emotion and a direct engagement with these primal, fertile energies. The Anthesteria, for example, was a major Athenian spring festival, celebrating the blooming of flowers and the tasting of the new wine from the previous autumn's harvest. It was a complex festival, with various stages, including a day when the pithoi, large wine jars, were opened, libations were poured, and much wine was consumed. It also had a more somber aspect, a day dedicated to the souls of the dead, acknowledging the link between life, death, and renewal that Dionysus, like Persephone, embodied. Then there was the Lenaea, another Athenian festival held in winter, associated with the winepress and the production of new wine, featuring dramatic contests and often raucous, joyful processions. And throughout the countryside, various rural Dionysia were celebrated, more rustic affairs, but equally focused on invoking the god's power to ensure the fertility of the fields and vineyards for the coming year. These were times when communities came together to release pent-up energies, to laugh, to sing, to dance, and to participate in rituals that, however strange they might seem to us, were believed to be essential for awakening the dormant life force of the earth. The dress code for a typical Dionysian revel was often best described as enthusiastic disarray, or perhaps creatively draped local fauna. Very avant-garde, very low maintenance, and probably not something you'd wear to a serious meeting with your bank manager, unless your bank manager was also a particularly devoted Maenad. A key element in many Dionysian rites was enthusiasmos, the state of being filled with the god, or mania, a kind of sacred madness or ecstatic trance. His female followers, the Maenads, or Bacchae as they were also known, were famous for their wild ecstatic dances in the mountains, their hair unbound, often clad in fawn skins carrying thyrsi, and sometimes believed to possess superhuman strength, or to engage in the ritual tearing apart of wild animals, sparagmos, in their divinely inspired frenzy. Now for our sleepy journey, we're not going to dwell too long on the more extreme or unsettling aspects of this Dionysian ecstasy. But it's important to understand that for the ancient Greeks, this madness was not necessarily seen as a negative state. It was a sacred condition, a temporary dissolution of the individual ego, allowing a direct, unmediated connection with the raw, creative, and overwhelmingly fertile power of the god and of nature itself. The precise nature and extent of genuine ecstatic mania experienced by participants in these Dionysian rituals, particularly by the Maenads, versus the degree to which their wild behavior was a structured, highly ritualized performance within a controlled religious context, intended to evoke these feelings, is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate and careful reinterpretation, drawing on textual descriptions like Euripides' famous play The Bacchae, vivid iconographic representations on pottery, and comparative anthropological studies of ecstatic cults in other cultures. The symbols associated with Dionysus are all deeply evocative of his fertile power. The grapevine, obviously, with its promise of intoxicating fruit. The tenacious evergreen ivy that often wreathed his brow, or his thyrsus, symbolizing enduring life. The thyrsus itself, that fennel stalk tipped with a pine cone, was a potent fertility symbol, sometimes even interpreted as a disguised phallus, and the animals sacred to him. The virile goat, the powerful bull, the sleek and untamable panther, or leopard often shown pulling his chariot, all carried strong connotations of procreative energy and wild natural forces. Even the Mass, so central to the theatrical performances at his festivals, spoke of transformation, of stepping outside one's ordinary self, of embodying another persona, another aspect of the life force. So while the rites of Dionysus might seem chaotic, even transgressive, their underlying purpose was often profoundly connected to the renewal of life, the breaking down of old sterile structures to allow for new vibrant growth. If your normally very staid and proper olive tree suddenly started producing a few surprisingly juicy grapes, after a particularly enthusiastic Dionysian festival passed through your village, you wouldn't be entirely surprised. Dionysus, it seems, had that kind of contagiously fertile effect on the world around him. He was in essence the patron saint of letting your hair down with wild abandon so the crops can grow up with equal enthusiasm. A very important, if occasionally rather noisy and somewhat exhausting, ecological and spiritual service for the ancient Greek world. You've just been swept up in the imagined intoxicating whirl of a Dionysian festival, where the consumption of new wine, the ecstatic dances, and the temporary release from everyday constraints were all part of a sacred effort to awaken the untamed vegetative life force of the earth and ensure its continued wild abundance. Dionysus, as we've seen, was a god of profound, irrepressible fertility. His influence felt in the rising sap of spring and the intoxicating fruit of the vine. And among the many curious and often uninhibited ways the ancient Greeks sought to honor him and invoke his generative power, one particular type of ritual stands out for its sheer unabashed, and to our modern eyes, perhaps startlingly direct symbolism, the phallic procession, or phallophoria. These parades, featuring large, often comically exaggerated representations of the male generative organ, were a common and integral part of many fertility rites, particularly those dedicated to Dionysus, and were believed to be a potent way to promote the fecundity of the land livestock, and indeed human beings themselves. Now, before your modern sensibilities perhaps do a little internal gasp or a polite cough of surprise, it's crucial to understand that for the ancient Greeks and for many ancient cultures around the world, overt representations of human generative organs when used in a sacred or ritual context were not necessarily seen as obscene or pornographic in the way we might immediately perceive them today. Instead, the phallus in particular was often viewed as a powerful, almost magical symbol of life creation, procreation, strength, and the very generative force of nature itself. It represented the power to bring forth new life, to ensure abundance, to ward off barrenness and decay. So when you see these symbols being paraded through the fields or village streets, Try to imagine them not through a lens of modern prudishness, but through the eyes of an ancient Greek farmer or villager for whom this was a serious, if sometimes joyfully raucous religious act aimed at securing the very foundations of their existence. They weren't being deliberately crude, they were being symbolically potent. Go big or go home was clearly the prevailing motto for the Sacred Phallus Design Committee in many of these communities. Subtlety was not always on the agenda when you were trying to get the urgent attention of the gods of growth. These phallic processions were a particularly notable feature of the various Dionysian festivals, such as the rural Dionysia, which were celebrated in the countryside in winter, or the city Dionysia in Athens, which also included dramatic performances. During these events, participants would carry these phalloi, often carved from wood or leather, sometimes molded from bread dough and frequently painted bright red, was a popular color associated with lifeblood and apotropic power, aloft on poles much like ceremonial standards or banners. These weren't always anatomically precise, mind you. They were often highly stylized, sometimes comically oversized, and occasionally even winged, or given other fantastical attributes emphasizing their symbolic rather than literal nature. Sometimes these ritual phalloi were further adorned with ribbons, garlands of ivy sacred to Dionysus, or even little bells attached to them, transforming them into not just potent symbols of generative power, but also rather festive, surprisingly jingly mobile parade floats of procreation. The procession itself would wind its way through the community, perhaps from a sanctuary of Dionysus, out into the newly plowed fields or vineyards, or through the village streets. It would be accompanied by hymns sung in honor of the god known as phallic songs, or phallica, by music, perhaps the reedy skirl of the aulos, a type of double pipe and the rhythmic beat of drums or tambourines by dancing, and very often by a good deal of ritualized jesting mockery and what the Greeks called aishrologia, that same kind of ribald, obscene, or abusive language we encountered in the women-only Thesmophoria. This licensed buffoonery and joyous rudeness were thought to be pleasing to Dionysus to ward off evil spirits, or the envious evil eye which could cause infertility or blight, and to generally stir up the generative energies of both the participants and the land itself. It was a serious ritual, but one that often embraced laughter chaos and a temporary suspension of everyday decorum as a means to a sacred end. What was the underlying purpose of these rather bold parades? Several intertwined ideas were likely at play. Firstly, it was a powerful act of sympathetic magic. By prominently displaying and celebrating this potent symbol of male generative power, the participants were in a sense showing the earth the crops, the livestock, and even the human community what they desired: abundant fertility, strong new growth, and the continuation of life. It was a visual prayer, a bold declaration of hope for fecundity. In some local phallic processions, the designated phallus bearer, a role of some honor, if perhaps also some slight social awkwardness depending on the size of the prop, might engage in mock fertilization of the fields by symbolically dipping the tip of the phallic pole into the earth at various points, or even playfully, one hopes, chasing young women with it. All part of a ritualized and ideally good-humored attempt to awaken and transmit the generative powers of nature in the community. Modern health and safety inspectors, not to mention HR departments, would probably have a collective apoplectic fit at such goings-on today. But in ancient Greece, it was all part of the sacred, if slightly boisterous, agricultural toolkit. Secondly, these phallic symbols were considered to have strong apotropic qualities, the power to avert evil. Just as an aggressive display can ward off a physical threat, the overt, almost confrontational display of the symbol of life force was thought to repel negative influences, sterility, blight, and any malevolent spirits that might seek to harm the community or its resources. It was a bold, assertive charm against the forces of barrenness and decay. Of course, these processions were also a direct way of honoring Dionysus himself, celebrating his role as a god of rampant natural power of wine that loosens inhibitions, and of the irrepressible urge towards procreation. The phallus was one of his key attributes, a visual shorthand for his particular divine portfolio. The precise balance in the symbolic meaning of these Greek phallic processions, whether they were primarily aimed at direct generative magic for agricultural and human fertility, also served a very significant apotropic function to ward off evil influences, or perhaps contained strong elements of carnivalesque social satire, licensed transgression, and a humorous release from the strictures of everyday social decorum. is a topic that continues to generate diverse and fascinating interpretations among classicists, anthropologists, and historians of religion. It was likely all of these things at once, a rich, multi-layered ritual performance. Beyond the grand Dionysian festivals, phallic symbols were not uncommon in other quieter contexts related to fertility and protection. Small phallic amulets might be worn for good luck or to promote personal virility. And as we'll see when we meet the rustic garden god Priapus, his entire divine persona was essentially one giant, ever-vigilant phallic symbol guarding over orchards and vegetable patches. Imagine the scene if you were an ancient Greek. You might encounter these symbols quite regularly. "Oh, look, dear," a mother might say to her child as a particularly festive Dionysian procession goes by. It's the annual fertilizer fiesta again, a wonderful display of civic agricultural enthusiasm. Best bring the youngest children indoors, just for a moment, or perhaps send them out with a small, discreet notebook for their advanced agricultural studies and symbolic interpretation homework. The ancient Greeks, it seems, had a remarkably robust and matter-of-fact approach to the symbols of life's continuation. Okay, I understand you'd like Section 7 of the script for strange ancient Greek rituals for fertility blessings. I will write this section according to the outline and all the specified rules, aiming for the 1,300-1,400 word count, and handling the potentially challenging subject matter with the established, gentle, and sleepy tone. Here is Section 7. Section 7. You've just been swept along in the imagined, heady revelries of a Dionysian festival, where the overt display of phallic symbols and the joyous, uninhibited celebrations were all aimed at awakening the raw, procreative energies of nature and ensuring abundance for the community. That was one rather boisterous path to seeking fertility's blessings. But the ancient Greek world, in its rich diversity, offered many different avenues to the divine, and many different, sometimes startlingly contrasting ritual expressions of this universal human desire for life's continuation. So now let us travel in our sleepy minds from the wine-soaked ecstasies of Dionysus to the altogether more austere, more disciplined, and frankly rather more eye-wateringly intense atmosphere of ancient Sparta, and explore the peculiar and famously harsh rituals performed in honor of Artemis Orthia rituals that in their own unique Spartan way were also believed to contribute to the vigor and future fertility of their youth. Artemis, as you may recall, was the Olympian goddess of the hunt, the wilderness wild animals, the moon, and somewhat paradoxically for an eternally virgin deity, a crucial protectress of childbirth and young girls. In Sparta, that famously militaristic and stoic city-state in the Peloponnese, Artemis was worshipped under the local epithet Orthia, or sometimes Borthia. This Orthia may have been an earlier indigenous Peloponnesian goddess of nature and fertility, who was later syncretized with the more widely known Olympian Artemis, retaining some of her own ancient, perhaps rather primal characteristics. Her sanctuary, located near the banks of the Eurotas River, was a place of considerable antiquity and importance in Spartan religious life. And it was here at her altar that one of the most notorious, and to our modern sensibilities, truly strange rituals of the ancient world took place, the diamastagosis, or ritual flogging of young Spartan boys. Now, when you think fertility ritual, a public whipping of adolescents is probably not the first image that springs to mind. It seems more like a particularly harsh form of character-building punishment, which for the Spartans, it certainly also was. Your average Spartan kid's idea of a challenging team-building exercise probably made a modern military boot camp look like a gentle, contemplative stroll in a particularly fluffy, well-manicured park. But within the Spartan worldview, this ordeal was deeply intertwined with notions of youthful vigor, endurance, the transition to manhood, and by extension, the future strength and continuity of the Spartan state, which absolutely depended on producing strong warriors and healthy mothers. The annual festival for Artemis Orthia in ancient Sparta indeed included the diamastagosis, a ritual in which Spartan youths, or ephebes, were flogged, sometimes with considerable severity at the goddess's altar. This was ostensibly presented as a test of their endurance, their courage, and their adherence to Spartan discipline. A critical rite of passage into full citizenship and warrior status, though its deeper, more ancient origins may well have been connected to older fertility or propitiatory rites designed to ensure the well-being of the community. Imagine the scene: young Spartan boys, perhaps in their mid to late teens, their bodies hardened by years of the famously rigorous Spartan training system, the agoge. They approached the altar of Artemis Orthia. According to some accounts, particularly from later Roman-era observers like Pausanias and Plutarch, when the ritual had arguably become a more brutalized public spectacle for tourist cheeses were placed upon the altar, and the boys had to attempt to snatch them while being vigorously whipped by older youths or priests brandishing slender rods. The boy who endured the most lashes without crying out, or who managed to grab the most cheeses, the details vary, was hailed as a victor, his endurance a mark of honor. It was a display of pure, unadulterated Spartan grit. One certainly hopes the cheese was exceptionally good, perhaps a divinely sharp feta, or a particularly robust goat's cheese to make all that strenuous skin-tingling effort worthwhile. Absolutely worth every single lash for another slice of that divine cheddar, lads? My back may be a roadmap of heroic welts, but my spirit and my cheese cravings, are undaunted. How could such a seemingly brutal ordeal be connected to fertility blessings? The links are perhaps less direct than a phallic procession, but they are there woven into the Spartan understanding of communal well-being. Firstly, it was a rite of passage. By enduring the pain and demonstrating their toughness, these young men were proving their fitness to become Spartan warriors, the defenders of the state, and crucially, the future fathers of the next generation of Spartan citizens. A strong, disciplined, and enduring male population was essential for the survival and fertility of the Spartan polis itself. Secondly, some scholars suggest that the shedding of blood at the altar, even in this ritualized, non-fatal way, might have been seen as a symbolic offering to the goddess, a way of feeding her power or propitiating her somewhat wild, untamed nature, thereby ensuring her continued favor and protection over the land and its people, including their agricultural and human fecundity. It's a very ancient idea that blood spilled upon the earth or at a sacred site can magically stimulate life and growth. There's a particularly quirky and rather grim little tidbit concerning this ritual recounted by Pausanias. He tells us that the ancient wooden statue Zoanon of Artemis Orthia, housed in her temple, was believed to be the very one stolen from the land of the Tauri in the Crimea by Orestes and Iphigenia as told in myth. This statue itself was said to be very small, ancient, and rather bloodthirsty, supposedly demanding human nourishment. According to Pausanias, an oracle had once demanded human sacrifice to appease this image, but Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver, changed the custom to the flogging of youths at the altar so that the altar might still be stained with human blood, in a symbolic if still rather intense way. Furthermore, it's said that the priestess of Artemis Orthia would stand by during the diamastagosis holding this ancient, surprisingly lightweight wooden statue of the goddess. If the floggers were being too lenient with a particular boy or not laying on the lashes with sufficient Spartan enthusiasm, the statue would supposedly become inexplicably heavy in her arms, weighing down her hands as a sign of the goddess's divine displeasure and her demand for more vigorous, encouragement for the youth in question. Talk about divine micromanagement of your ritualized endurance tests and a very clear message from Artemis to try harder, lads. The original meaning and primary purpose of the Spartan diamastagosis at the altar of Artemis Orthia, whether it was fundamentally an initiatory rite of passage into full Spartan manhood, a symbolic substitution for much earlier, perhaps even pre-Hellenic human sacrifice, a magical ritual intended to ensure the fertility and vigor of the land and its youth through sympathetic magic or propitiation, or a complex combination of these and other socio-religious factors that evolved and perhaps even became distorted over the many centuries of its practice, especially by the Roman period, when it became a rather notorious tourist attraction, remains a subject of considerable debate and diverse interpretation among classical scholars and historians of ancient religion. While this specific famous ritual focused on boys, it's important to remember that Spartan girls also underwent a famously rigorous system of physical education and training unique in the Greek world, which was explicitly believed to make them strong and healthy, capable of bearing robust children who would become future warriors and citizens. So the entire Spartan system for both sexes was geared towards producing a vigorous, enduring, and fertile populace in their own very particular and often very demanding way. Their fertility rituals weren't necessarily about soft prayers and gentle offerings. They were often about discipline, endurance, and a rather fierce commitment to the collective strength of the state. Your average Spartan parent-teacher night was probably quite intense. Young Leonidas is showing excellent spear-thrusting technique and a commendable disregard for personal comfort, but his pain tolerance during competitive cheese snatching at the Orthia Festival still needs a little work if he's to bring true honor to our bloodline. Marcioi, you've just shivered your way through the rather intense cheese snatching and undeniably strange Spartan rituals at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where young boys endured ritual floggings all in the name of forging youthful vigor and, by Spartan extension, ensuring the future strength and continuity of their highly disciplined city-state. That was one very particular and rather eye-watering path to securing a community's future vitality. But for most other ancient Greeks, when they thought about the continuation of their families, the blessing of children, and the sanctity of the lineage, their prayers and rituals would often turn towards a different, though equally powerful Olympian deity, Hera, the august queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, and the preeminent divine patroness of marriage and legitimate childbirth. Her domain was the oikos, the household, and her blessing was crucial for ensuring its fruitful future. Hera, as the wife of the mighty Zeus, and therefore the queen of Olympus, held a position of immense honor and authority. Even if her mythological marriage was often, shall we say, a tad tempestuous thanks to Zeus's notoriously wandering eye and his penchant for ill-advised dalliances with nymphs mortals, and the occasional unsuspecting farm animal in disguise. Despite the divine soap opera that often characterized her relationship with her husband, Hera was principally worshipped throughout the Greek world as the goddess of marriage, Hera Teleia, meaning Hera the fulfiller or perfecter of marriage. And by extension, she was a vital protectress of married women childbirth within wedlock and the overall sanctity and continuity of the family unit. If you were an ancient Greek hoping for a stable marriage that would be blessed with healthy, legitimate children to carry on your name and inherit your hopefully not too heavily mortgaged olive grove Hera, was definitely the goddess you wanted on your side. Keeping Hera happy was absolutely key for a peaceful home, a harmonious marriage, and a bustling nursery full of tiny future citizens. You did not want to be on her bad side if you were hoping for legitimate heirs. Just ask any of Zeus's numerous and often rather tragically transformed or relentlessly persecuted extracurricular interests and their unfortunate offspring. The importance of marriage in ancient Greek society cannot be overstated. It wasn't primarily about romantic love in the modern sense, though. Affection could certainly grow. Marriage was a crucial social, economic, and civic contract designed to unite families, transfer property, and most importantly, to produce legitimate children, especially male heirs, who could continue the family lineage, maintain the household cult of the ancestors, inherit the family estate, and become future citizens and defenders of the polis, the city-state. Fertility within this legally sanctioned union was therefore of paramount importance. A childless marriage could be a source of great personal sorrow, social shame, and even a threat to the continuity of the family line. Thus, rituals and offerings to Hera Teleia, seeking her divine blessing upon a marriage and its potential fruitfulness, were a vital part of Greek religious life. One of the most significant ritual expressions of Hera's connection to marriage and fertility was the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage, a festival that commemorated the mythical wedding of Zeus and Hera. This was celebrated in various forms and at different times in many Greek cities, particularly at major sanctuaries of Hera, like those in Argos Samos or Olympia. The annual reenactment or symbolic representation of this divine union, the marriage of the sky god and the earth associated in some of her earlier aspects, queen goddess, was believed to magically promote the fertility of the land, the livestock, and of course, human beings. It was like a divine cosmic booster shot for all things generative. The festival might involve processions, sacrifices, feasts, and perhaps even a ritual drama where figures representing Zeus and Hera were brought together in a symbolic consummation. It was probably like the ultimate divine vow renewal ceremony, but with more widespread agricultural benefits, and one hopes for Hera's sake considerably less likelihood of Zeus immediately trying to chat up one of the celestial bridesmaids. Young women, as they approached marriageable age, might also participate in rituals or festivals dedicated to Hera, seeking her guidance and blessing for their transition into married life and their future role as mothers. In some places like Elise near Olympia, there was a festival called the Heraia, which included foot races for virgin girls, perhaps serving as a kind of rite of passage or demonstration of their fitness for marriage and childbearing, all under the patronage of the Queen of the Gods. It was a more athletic and certainly less cheese-focused version of preparing for future familial duties than the Spartan boys endured for Artemis Orthia. Newly married Greek women would make specific offerings to Hera at her temples or household shrines, perhaps dedicating locks of their hair or their childhood girdles, the belts they wore as unmarried maidens, symbolizing their transition to married status and making a heartfelt plea for her blessing on their future fruitfulness. It was like a very serious, divinely witnessed relationship status update, offering hoping for lots of little likes from the Queen of Heaven in the form of healthy babies to fill their new home. Common offerings to Hera also included pomegranates, a fruit bursting with seeds and thus a potent ancient symbol of fertility and abundance, as well as small cakes, libations of wine or milk, and sometimes terracotta votive offerings representing women, children, or symbols of marriage. If you were really trying to get on Hera's good side, especially if you were hoping for a son and heir, leaving her a particularly juicy pomegranate and promising to name your firstborn. If male, of course, Heracles, glory of Hera, was probably a good strategic move, though ironically, the mythical Heracles himself was a constant reminder of Zeus's infidelity and suffered Hera's wrath for much of his life. So maybe choose your baby names carefully. The evolution of Hera's cult and her complex mythological persona, from what some scholars suggest might have been a powerful pre-Hellenic great goddess figure in her own right, perhaps with broader dominion over the earth and its fecundity to the often characterized as jealous, sometimes shrewish, but still undeniably formidable, wife of Zeus within the established Olympian pantheon. And how this transformation impacted the specific rituals and the primary focus of her worship concerning fertility and female power is a continuing area of rich discussion and fascinating debate among scholars of Greek religion and mythology. Was her focus on legitimate marital fertility a later Olympian patriarchal narrowing of an older, more encompassing feminine power? Or was she always primarily concerned with the ordered, socially sanctioned continuation of the family unit? What is clear is that for an ancient Greek woman hoping to conceive and bear healthy children, within the respected bonds of marriage, Hera was an indispensable divine ally. Her temples were places of earnest prayer, her festivals were opportunities to reaffirm the sanctity of family, and her blessing was seen as essential for the happy, fruitful continuation of the oikos, the very foundation of Greek society. She was the august matron of Olympus, ensuring that the future of both gods and mortals, through legitimate and blessed unions, would unfold as it should. You've just been contemplating the rather august and sometimes formidable presence of Hera Teleia, the queen of the Olympian gods and the divine guardian of marriage, whose blessing was so crucial for ensuring the legitimacy and fruitfulness of the ancient Greek family unit. Keeping Hera happy was vital for domestic harmony and the recognized continuation of your lineage. But before you even got to the stage of needing Hera's marital sanction and her assistance with producing a nursery full of strapping little future hoplites or wise priestesses, another altogether more enchanting and often rather more unpredictable divine power usually had to play her part, the irresistible Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, desire, pleasure, and by very natural extension, procreation. For without that initial spark of attraction, that sweet madness of desire that Aphrodite so masterfully ignited, the whole grand project of continuing the Greek race would have likely stalled at the starting gate, much to the despair of anxious parents and civic leaders alike. Her kiss, metaphorical or perhaps sought through ritual, was often the first hope for future conception. Aphrodite, often said to have been born from the seafoam Aphros in Greek near Cyprus, or sometimes named as a daughter of Zeus and Dione, was a goddess of almost universal power, her influence affecting gods and mortals alike, often with gloriously romantic or hilariously chaotic results. She was attended by the Graces, chariots who personified charm and beauty, and by her mischievous arrow-shooting son Eros Cupid, to the Romans who delighted in a bit of divine matchmaking, or sometimes divine meddling. As the goddess of love, beauty, and procreation, Aphrodite was widely worshipped throughout the Greek world. Individuals, particularly young men and women and couples hoping to conceive, would make offerings at her many temples and shrines, seeking her divine favor for romantic success, enduring marital bliss, and most importantly for our sleepy exploration, the precious blessing of children. Imagine yourself as a young ancient Greek, your heart aflutter with the first stirrings of love, or perhaps a newly married individual earnestly hoping to start a family. You would naturally turn to Aphrodite. You might visit one of her sanctuaries, perhaps her famous ancient temple in Paphos on Cyprus, or one of her shrines in Corinth, a city particularly known for her worship, or even just a small local altar dedicated to her. Here, you would make your offerings hoping to catch her divine attention and win her favor. Common offerings to Aphrodite were things of beauty and sweetness reflecting her own domains. Fragrant incense garlands of myrtle. A plant sacred to her fresh roses, another of her symbols. Ripe apples or quinces, often associated with love and marriage, and libations of sweet wine or honey. Small stylized doves or sparrows birds also sacred to her, due to their amorous natures might be offered in terracotta or even precious metal form. It was sometimes believed that whispering your heart's desire for a child, or for a loving partner with whom to have children, to a pair of particularly affectionate billing doves at Aphrodite's temple was a very effective way to get your message directly to the goddess's, her divine inbox. Divine, probably far more reliable than trying to send a prayer via Hermes, who for all his speed might get sidetracked delivering other less romantically urgent divine packages. Prayers to Aphrodite for fertility would focus not just on the act of conception itself, but on the enduring love and desire between partners that was seen as a vital foundation for a happy and fruitful family. She was asked to bless the marriage bed, to make it a place of joy and fecundity, to ensure that the union would be blessed with healthy, beautiful children who would bring honor to their parents and their lineage. Her influence was about ensuring the attraction and the passion were there, which, in the ancient Greek view, were essential ingredients for successful procreation, just as much as Hera's sanction of the marriage itself. Without Aphrodite doing her divine duty of sparking that initial swipe-right ancient Greek-style moment, and keeping the romantic embers glowing, the whole grand project of building a family would have been a much more utilitarian affair. The precise nature and evolution of Aphrodite's cult, particularly the balance between her aspects as a goddess, of what some later philosophers termed heavenly spiritual love. Aphrodite Urania versus a more earthly physical desire. Aphrodite Pandemos, and how these potentially different distinctions were reflected in specific fertility-related rituals, or understood by different social groups or in different city-states, remain subjects of ongoing scholarly discussion and rich interpretation of ancient texts, inscriptions, and iconographic evidence from her many sanctuaries. Was she always seen as a unified force, or did worshippers emphasize different facets of her power depending on their needs? Beyond direct prayers and offerings for children, Aphrodite was also sometimes invoked in what we might loosely term love magic, or the use of philtra. Spells, charms, or potions designed to inspire love or desire in a particular individual. While the aim here might be primarily romantic conquest, the underlying hope, especially if marriage was the goal, would often include the eventual blessing of children. These practices, sometimes treading a fine line between accepted religious piety and more shadowy magical arts, still acknowledged Aphrodite as the ultimate source of erotic power. If your intended beloved wasn't noticing your carefully composed odes, or your impressive discus throwing skills, a quiet appeal to Aphrodite for a little divine intervention in the attraction department, perhaps accompanied by a very strategically dropped enchanted apple. A fruit often associated with her and with love tokens was the ancient Greek equivalent of a carefully curated social media profile, a well-timed DM, and a killer playlist. Results, of course, might vary, and sometimes, as Paris found out with his golden apple, could lead to rather more significant divine entanglements and city-destroying wars than initially bargained for. There's a quirky little tidbit that in some local cults, small, rather charming boat-shaped terracotta offerings have been found at Aphrodite's shrines. These might have been symbolic of her mythical sea birth from the foam afros, a nod to her origins. Or perhaps they represented a wish for a smooth voyage in love and marriage, a plea for her to guide one's romantic ship safely to the shores of a happy, fruitful union, avoiding the rocks of rejection or the storms of marital strife. It's a lovely, gentle image, Aphrodite as the divine pilot of the heart. So, as the ancient Greek couple hoped for the laughter of children to fill their home, they would look not only to the matronly Hera for the sanctity and legitimacy of their family, but also to the golden, enchanting Aphrodite the goddess, who could weave the irresistible magic of desire, ensuring that their union was not just dutiful, but also blessed with the sweet, life-giving passion that was in itself a divine gift, a vital spark for conception's hope, leaving her a really nice fragrant rose and promising to name your firstborn. If a daughter something suitably lovely like Coralia, after the sea, or Myrtle, was probably a very good move. She undoubtedly appreciated the branding and the aesthetic effort. You've just been basking in the golden rose-scented aura of Aphrodite, the irresistible goddess whose divine influence sparked the desires and blessed the unions that led to new generations of ancient Greeks. Her temples were places of beauty, her offerings often sweet and fragrant, her power associated with the more alluring and poetic aspects of love and procreation. But the ancient Greek quest for fertility wasn't always so concerned with Olympian elegance or romantic charm, sometimes especially when it came to the straightforward earthy business of making sure your cabbages grew plump and your fruit trees were laden. They turned to a rather more rustic, more direct, and to our modern eyes, perhaps comically unabashed deity Priapus, the garden god, whose most prominent feature left absolutely no doubt as to his primary divine function. He was the ancient world's most enthusiastically phallic guardian of green and growing things. Now, Priapus wasn't one of your top-tier A-list Olympian gods hobnobbing with Zeus and Hera at celestial banquets. He was more of a minor, if widely recognized, rustic deity, particularly popular in rural areas, market gardens, orchards, vineyards, and anywhere that everyday folk were trying to coax a decent living from the soil. Statues or herms of Priapus, a minor Greco-Roman fertility god, usually depicted as a somewhat misshapen or comically rustic figure with an exaggerated permanently erect phallus, were commonly placed in these cultivated spaces. His primary role was as a protector of these gardens and fields, guarding them against thieves, both human and avian, warding off blight and harmful influences, and of course magically promoting the fruitfulness of the crops, livestock, and beehives within his domain. His iconography was, well, let's just say it was not known for its subtlety. Priapus was not a god of veiled metaphors or delicate allusions when it came to the business of generation. His approach was more akin to a very large, very obvious, divinely sanctioned billboard advertisement for vigorous growth and abundant production. His origins are a bit muddled in the myths, as is often the case with these more localized ancient deities. He was most commonly said to be the son of Dionysus, the god of wine and wild fertility, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and procreation herself, a parentage that certainly explains his enthusiastic commitment to all things generative. He was believed to have originated in the city of Lampsacus on the Hellespont in Asia Minor, and his cult gradually spread throughout the Greek and later Roman worlds. According to one rather amusing myth, Hera, the ever-watchful and often rather prickly queen of the gods, was jealous of Aphrodite, or whichever nymph was cited as Priapus's mother in that particular version of the story, and cursed Priapus while he was still in the womb. This curse supposedly ensured he would be born rather ugly, somewhat misshapen, and most famously endowed with his astonishingly disproportionate and perpetually active attribute. It's as if he was divinely ordained from birth to be the eternal, slightly awkward and over-enthusiastic garden gnome of the entire Greco-Roman pantheon, a figure both potent and at times a subject of gentle or not-so-gentle rustic humor. He probably wasn't winning any divine beauty contests against Apollo, but for sheer, unadulterated, get-your-vegetables-to-thrive and scare off the crow's energy, he was undoubtedly your go-to deity. The statues of Priapus placed in gardens were often roughly carved from wood, often painted a vibrant red, a color associated with life power and apotropaic magic, or sometimes made of stone or terracotta. They weren't meant to be masterpieces of classical sculpture. Their crudeness was often part of their rustic charm and their perceived efficacy. They would stand there conspicuously among the vines and vegetables, a constant visible reminder of the generative forces of nature, and a rather stern warning to any would-be pilferers. So if you were a naughty bird thinking of making off with a prize-winning bunch of grapes, or a local youth with a midnight craving for your neighbor's juiciest figs, you'd probably take one look at Priapus's very direct and rather intimidating statue and decide that today was an excellent day to perhaps try a nice uncursed and entirely unguarded patch of wild berries instead. The offerings made to Priapus were in keeping with his rustic domain. The first fruits of the harvest, garlands of flowers, libations of milk or honey, simple cakes, and sometimes perhaps even the sacrifice of a donkey, an animal with which he had a rather complicated and in some myths comically antagonistic relationship. There were no grand temples dedicated to him in major cities for the most part. His worship was more personal, more direct, carried out by farmers and gardeners in the very spaces he was meant to protect and make fruitful. The precise origins of Priapus's cult and his conspicuous, highly specific iconography, whether he developed from an even earlier Anatolian or Thracian local agricultural fertility spirit, whose attributes were simply very frankly represented, or the extent to which his worship, even by his most earnest devotees, was always intended to be partly humorous, satirical, and a release from more staid religious decorum, or how his role evolved from a purely rustic protector of crops to a figure sometimes invoked in more urban settings or even in slightly risque literary contexts, like the Latin Priapeia, a collection of often witty and obscene poems attributed to him, are still subjects of ongoing and often quite lively discussion among scholars of ancient religion folklore and classical literature. What is clear is that his primary functions were twofold: to promote fertility and to protect property. His prominent phallus was not just a symbol of generative power meant to magically encourage the crops to grow thick and fast. It was also a potent apotropaic symbol, a magical evil eye deflector designed to ward off harm blight and especially thieves. Farmers would sometimes even inscribe rather cheeky and often quite explicit threatening verses on the base of his statues, warning anyone who dared to steal their produce that they would face rather uncomfortable supernaturally inflicted personal consequences, all courtesy of the gods. Well, his most impressively obvious and ever vigilant divine attribute. It was a very direct and surprisingly effective form of ancient divine copyright protection and anti-theft system for your prize-winning pumpkins and prize cucumbers. So as you imagine an ancient Greek farmer or a Roman villa owner carefully placing a brightly painted, somewhat leering statue of Priapus amongst their precious grapevines, or in their carefully tended vegetable patch, remember that this wasn't just a crude joke or a piece of rustic garden art. It was a serious, if sometimes humorously expressed appeal to a very ancient and very direct form of divine power. A plea for abundance, a ward against misfortune, and a celebration of the raw, unapologetic, and essential force of nature's own procreative urge. Priapus the garden's grotesque but effective guardian was a vital, if somewhat blush-inducing player in the ancient quest for fertility's blessings. You've just encountered the rather unique and unapologetically rustic charms of Priapus, the phallic garden god whose very presence was intended to ensure your lettuces grew lush and your fruit trees bore abundantly, all while scaring off any light-fingered neighbors or particularly peckish pigeons. His was a very direct, very visual form of fertility magic and apotropic evil-averting protection. But beyond these more prominent displays, the ancient Greeks employed a whole host of other, often more subtle and personal rituals. Charms and chants specifically aimed at averting the dreaded specter of barrenness, whether it threatened their fields, their livestock, or their own families. In a world where infertility could be seen as a divine curse or the result of malevolent influences, taking proactive magical measures was not just sensible. It was practically a civic duty. The fear of barrenness, as we've touched upon, was a profound and pervasive anxiety in ancient Greek society. A field that failed to yield a ewe that produced no lambs, a marriage that remained childless. These were not just private disappointments. They could be seen as ominous signs, disruptions in the natural order, or evidence of some hidden fault or spiritual pollution that needed to be addressed. Therefore, alongside their prayers and offerings to the great fertility gods and goddesses, we've already met ancient Greeks widely utilized a fascinating array of apotropaic practices, that is, rituals or objects designed to turn away or ward off evil, harm, bad luck, or any unseen forces that might seek to stifle life's precious generative power. This is a mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks utilized a wide range of apotropaic practices, including the wearing of amulets, phylacteria, the recitation of specific incantations, apoidai, and various ritual actions to protect themselves, their livestock, and their crops from negative influences, such as the evil eye curses, malevolent spirits, or other unseen forces that might cause infertility, illness, or misfortune. One of the most common forms of this personal protection was the amulet or phylacterion. These were small objects worn on the person or hung in the home fields or stables, believed to possess magical power to deflect harm or attract good fortune, including fertility. Imagine an ancient Greek woman yearning for a child, carefully selecting an amulet to wear around her neck or tie to her girdle. What might it be made of? Semi-precious stones were popular. Carnelian, with its reddish hue, was often associated with lifeblood and vitality. Agate, with its banded patterns, might be seen as having protective qualities. Small stylized representations of phalloi or vulvae made of bronze bone or even terracotta were quite explicitly worn as fertility charms, their direct symbolism believed to invoke generative power and ward off impotency or barrenness. Figurines of particularly fertile animals like hares, known for their rapid reproduction, or frogs associated with water, rain, and abundance, could also serve as potent amulets. Sometimes specific herbs known for their connection to fertility goddesses or their perceived procreative virtues might be carried in a small linen pouch around the neck. That little frog amulet wasn't just a quirky fashion statement, it was your personal pocket-sized anti-barrenness bodyguard, probably more consistently effective in its own way than some of the more elaborate online dating advice you might find today. Then there were the knots. Knots held a powerful magical significance in many ancient cultures, representing binding and unbinding, obstruction and release. A knotted cord might be worn as an amulet to bind away infertility or to protect a pregnancy. Conversely, rituals involving the careful tying and then ceremonial untying of knots could be performed to magically unblock perceived impediments to conception or to ensure an easy childbirth. The intricate symbolism of knots was a subtle but potent form of magical intervention. Beyond wearable charms, the power of spoken words, incantations, sacred verses, or ipoidai was considered immense. Imagine a farmer walking through his newly sown fields at dusk, softly chanting an ancient formula passed down from his ancestors, a rhythmic plea for the earth to awaken and the seeds to sprout. Or a midwife attending a difficult birth, murmuring specific protective incantations over the laboring woman. Words believed to soothe pain, encourage the baby's passage, and ward off any malevolent spirits that might try to interfere at such a vulnerable moment. These weren't just empty words. They were believed to have inherent power to resonate with the unseen forces of the cosmos, to persuade or even compel the divine or natural world to act in a desired way. Repeating the psalm, Plodophoros, Plodophoros, Plodophoros. Plodophoros, meaning fruitful or fertile, 3 times while hopping on one leg under a full moon, and perhaps gently patting your most promising olive tree. Hey, if it seemed to work for Auntie Callisto's famously abundant olive grove down the lane, who were you to argue with generations of agricultural wisdom and a bit of enthusiastic nocturnal calisthenics? Ritual actions, often based on principles of sympathetic magic, where like produces like, were also common. We've seen this in the Thesmophoria with the mixing of decayed matter with seed grain. Other perhaps simpler household or agricultural rituals might involve actions like pouring libations of water or milk onto the earth, to encourage rain and moisture for crops, or carefully arranging specific stones or symbolic objects in a field or garden to create a kind of fertile grid. Some very localized or archaic Greek rituals might have involved practices that seem even more like enthusiastic gardening than a religious rite to our modern eyes, such as young women in certain rural cults, ritually rolling in freshly plowed fields under the new moon, hoping to directly absorb the Earth's procreative energies, or to sympathetically transfer their own youthful vitality to the soil. The ever-present fear of the evil eye, the belief that an envious or malicious glance could cause harm, illness, or misfortune, including barrenness in people, animals, or crops, also fueled many of these apotropic practices. You had to be constantly vigilant. One envious glare from your neighbor whose goats were suspiciously more productive and less prone to mysterious ailments than yours, and boom! Your prize sow is suddenly considering a vow of celibacy, and your best fig tree starts looking decidedly droopy. Better get that blue bead amulet polished and prominently displayed, or perhaps hang a particularly unappetizing-looking dried sea urchin over your doorway to deflect any incoming ill will. The precise distinction, if any, that ancient Greeks themselves consistently made between what we might categorize as religious appeals to their Olympian gods for fertility, like a formal prayer and sacrifice at a temple of Demeter, and what modern scholars might label as magical practices involving these more personal amulets, specific incantations or sympathetic rites, and whether these different approaches were seen by them as complementary, occasionally contradictory. or simply different facets of a broader spectrum of belief and ritual action available to them, is a complex issue still debated in the study of Greek popular religion and ancient lived experience. For many ancient Greeks, the lines were likely quite blurry. It was all part of a holistic effort to navigate a world filled with unseen powers and to secure life's most essential blessing, the continuation of life itself. Modern science might question the direct causal impact of a knotted string or a chanted phrase on human or agricultural conception rates. But if these charms and chants provided a sense of agency, a measure of comfort, and a feeling of control in a precarious and often unpredictable world, then that psychological reassurance was in itself a powerful and very real blessing. You've just been exploring the very personal and often quite charming world of ancient Greek apotropic magic. The amulets worn close to the heart, the whispered incantations, the knotted cords, all designed to ward off those unseen negative forces that might threaten personal fertility or household well-being. These were individual shields against misfortune. But what happened when misfortune, particularly in the form of widespread barrenness of the land, persistent famine, or devastating plague, seemed to grip an entire community, an entire polis? In such times of collective crisis, the ancient Greeks believed that the community itself might have become ritually polluted, having incurred the wrath of the gods or fallen victim to some pervasive miasma, a kind of spiritual contamination that stifled life and prosperity. To restore divine favor, to cleanse the land, and to allow fertility and abundance to return, more drastic communal purification rituals, or katharmoi, were deemed necessary. And some of these involved a rather strange and somber figure, the pharmakos, or scapegoat, an individual upon whom all the community's ills were symbolically loaded before they were then driven out, carrying the pollution away with them, hopefully leaving behind a purified space ready for fruitful fields and renewed life. The concept of miasma, or ritual pollution, was a powerful one in ancient Greek thought. It could be incurred through various means: an unavenged murder within the community, an act of sacrilege against a god or a sacred site, the breaking of solemn oaths, or even just the natural processes of birth and death, if not properly managed with purifying rites. This pollution was seen as a tangible, almost contagious stain that angered the gods, disrupted the natural order, and could manifest as collective misfortunes, failed harvests, disease in livestock, human infertility, or plagues. When such calamities struck, the community would look for ways to cleanse itself to restore its harmonious relationship with the divine. This often involved elaborate public ceremonies of purification, and in some particularly dire or traditional instances, the ritual of the pharmakos. Ancient Greek cities, particularly during times of widespread crisis such as plague, famine, or persistent infertility that threatened the community's survival, periodically performed these communal purification rituals, or katharmoi. These sometimes involved the symbolic, and in some debated, earlier or more extreme forms, possibly even literal expulsion of a pharmakos or scapegoat, an individual who was made to bear the community's collective pollution miasma in order to cleanse the city and restore divine favor and communal well-being. The selection of the pharmakos is, to our modern sensibilities, one of the most troubling aspects of this ancient ritual. It was typically not a respected member of the community who volunteered for this rather unpleasant civic duty. Instead, the person chosen was often someone already marginalized, an outsider within the city. Perhaps a beggar, a criminal, someone physically disabled or considered particularly ugly, or even a captive or foreigner. They were individuals whose expulsion, or in some darker interpretations of very ancient practices, whose very life was deemed expendable, someone upon whom the community could project its collective sins, its fears, and its misfortunes without too much internal social disruption. It's a grim reflection on how societies sometimes identify and ostracize the other in times of crisis. You really didn't want to win the Pharmakos of the Year award in ancient Greece. The prize was usually a one-way, all expenses paid by the community in the form of their projected guilt trip out of town, often accompanied by a great deal of enthusiastic, if not entirely friendly, encouragement with branches or stones to ensure you didn't dally on your way to the border. The ritual itself varied from place to place and over time, but it often involved several key stages. The chosen pharmakos might first be fed sometimes quite well for a certain period, perhaps with specific ritually significant foods like dried figs. Both black and white figs are mentioned in some accounts, barley cakes and cheese. This feeding might have been seen as a way of fattening them up metaphorically, making them a more substantial vessel to absorb the community's impurities. Or perhaps it was a remnant of an even older ritual where the individual was being prepared for a more literal sacrifice, though this is highly debated for the classical period. During some pharmakos rituals, as a rather quirky and specific tidbit, the chosen individual might be adorned in a rather uncomfortable fashion with strings of those symbolic figs hung around their neck, and then ritually beaten on their generative organs with branches of the wild fig tree or with squills, sea onions, plants which themselves had complex associations in Greek folklore, with both purification, rustic fertility. Remember, Priapus was sometimes associated with fig wood, and the driving out of evil? It was a very strange, very uncomfortable, and very public form of spiritual deep clean, designed to transfer all the bad vibes onto one unfortunate individual. After these preparatory rites, the pharmakos would be paraded through the city, often accompanied by a procession of citizens who might shout ritual imprecations, insults, or curses at them, further loading them with the community's collective negativity. The pharmakos was in essence becoming a living sponge for all the unseen ills, all the bad luck, all the divine anger that plagued the city. Then came the climax, the expulsion. The individual would be driven out beyond the city walls, beyond the sacred boundaries of the polis, symbolically carrying all that accumulated pollution away with them into the wilderness, or sometimes even cast into the sea. The hope was that with the pharmakos gone, the miasma would be gone too, the gods would be appeased, and the natural order, including the fertility of the land and its people, would be restored. Their rather blunt logic seemed to be, our crops are failing miserably, our goats are looking decidedly peaky, and nobody's had a baby in months. Clearly, someone specific needs to take all our collective bad vibes and go for a very long, entirely involuntary, and possibly rather brisk hike into the middle of nowhere. It's certainly a unique approach to community problem solving and agricultural policy. The historical reality and precise nature of the most extreme forms of pharmakos rituals in ancient Greece, particularly whether actual human sacrifice was ever a common or officially sanctioned practice in the classical period, as opposed to symbolic expulsion, or ritualized, though still potentially brutal beatings, or if such darker accounts were later literary exaggerations, misunderstandings of more symbolic acts of communal catharsis or even propaganda by rival city-states, remain highly contested and debated subjects among classical scholars. By the periods we are most familiar with, the ritual was more often about expulsion and purification than literal death, though it was still undoubtedly a terrifying and humiliating ordeal for the individual chosen. The connection to fertility, while perhaps not always direct in every single iteration of the pharmakos ritual, was often implicit. A community suffering from plague or famine was by definition a community whose collective life force or fertility was diminished. By purging the ills, by cleansing the slate, they were hoping to create a fresh, pure environment in which life could once again flourish. Crops could grow, livestock could thrive, and new generations could be born. Some pharmakos rituals, like those associated with the Thargelia festival in Athens, held in late spring, in honor of Apollo and Artemis, were explicitly timed to coincide with the ripening of the first fruits of the harvest, suggesting a direct link between this act of communal purification and the hope for agricultural abundance. Here you go, Apollo, have some lovely first fruit figs, the Athenians might say. And now, if you wouldn't mind, just taking this chap who has kindly agreed under considerable duress to absorb all our collective misfortune from the past year and ensuring he leaves permanently. Thanks ever so much. We'd really like a good olive harvest this autumn. Being a scapegoat in ancient Greece was undeniably a tough gig. No salary, no benefits, very little job security, and just the immense, thankless responsibility of carrying everyone else's bad luck, their spiritual grime, and their divine overdrafts out of town. It certainly wasn't a career path with many repeat applicants or glowing testimonials. But for the ancient Greek community, these strange and often somber rituals of purging were seen as a vital, if desperate, means of restoring balance, of cleansing their world, and of reopening the pathways for the essential blessings of fertility and life to flow once more. You've just explored the rather intense and sometimes decidedly uncomfortable world of ancient Greek pharmakoi rituals, where entire communities sought to purge themselves of collective ills and spiritual pollution by symbolically and sometimes quite literally expelling a scapegoat, all in the desperate hope of restoring divine favor and coaxing fertility back to their lands and homes. These were extreme measures for extreme times. But on a more regular, more integrated basis, the ancient Greeks had another profoundly important and almost universally practiced ritual for communicating with their gods, seeking their blessings, including those of fertility, giving thanks, and maintaining the harmonious balance between the mortal and divine realms, the act of animal sacrifice. Now, for our modern sensibilities, this too can seem like a strange and perhaps unsettling practice. But for the Greeks, it was a cornerstone of their religious life, a sacred transaction that nourished both the gods and the community, and was often believed to be essential for ensuring life's continued bounty. Animal sacrifice was not a rare or obscure rite. It was a central feature of almost all major festivals, public ceremonies, and many private acts of worship across the entire Greek world. It was performed to honor specific gods, to ask for their intervention in times of need, like before a battle, a sea voyage, or indeed before planting crops, or when hoping for a child to atone for offenses, or to offer thanks for blessings already received. The underlying idea was often that of a gift, a valuable offering given to the gods to gain their attention and goodwill. But it was also, very importantly, for most sacrifices to Olympian deities, a way to create a shared meal, a communion between gods and mortals. The gods, it was believed, partook of the smoke and aroma of the burning offering. Typically the thigh bones wrapped in fat and a few choice morsels, while the human community would feast on the remaining edible portions of the meat. This communal feast following the solemn ritual was a vital part of reinforcing social bonds and collectively sharing in the divine blessing that the sacrifice was intended to secure. The gods got the nice sizzle sounds and the fragrant smoke. The humans usually got the delicious roasted lamb or goat. Seems like a pretty good deal for the mortals, all things considered. Divine catering, it appears, often had some very tangible perks for the worshippers. When it came to seeking fertility blessings, specifically animal sacrifice played a crucial role. Different deities associated with fertility would receive particular types of animal victims, often chosen for their symbolic resonance. For instance, Demeter, the great Earth Mother and goddess of grain, frequently received sacrifices of pigs, especially pregnant sows, whose own fecundity was seen as a potent symbol and offering to encourage the earth's fruitfulness. We saw this in the context of the Thesmophoria, where piglets were central to the rites. Dionysus, the god of wine and wild, untamed vegetative power, might receive goats, an animal often associated with him and his satyr companions, and sometimes seen as a bit too fond of nibbling on grapevines. Thus, a fitting offering, or even bulls, symbols of immense procreative strength. Artemis, in her role as protectress of wild animals and a goddess of childbirth, might receive offerings of wild game or young, unblemished female animals. Hera, as goddess of marriage and legitimate offspring, would often be honored with sacrifices of heifers, symbolizing youthful female fertility within a domestic-controlled context. And Aphrodite, for matters of love and procreation, might receive offerings of doves or sparrows, birds known for their amorous natures. You certainly wouldn't want to accidentally offer Aphrodite a particularly grumpy old billy goat when she was clearly expecting a pair of lovely white cooing doves. That's how you get your romantic life divinely downgraded from epic poem to slightly awkward limerick. In ancient Greek sacrificial practice, the type and even the color of the animal victim were often carefully chosen to correspond with the specific deity being honored and the nature of the request. Chthonic deities, those of the earth and underworld who were often deeply connected to agricultural fertility and the cycle of life and death, like Demeter. In some of her aspects, or Gaia herself, the primordial earth often received black or dark-colored animals. The blood of these victims was sometimes allowed to soak directly into the earth or poured into a pit or bathros as a way of directly feeding or nourishing the earth spirits and ensuring their continued benevolence for the crops. Olympian gods. The sky dwellers, on the other hand, typically received white or light-colored animals, and the smoke from their portion of the sacrifice, the thigh bones wrapped in fat. The Gnisa would ascend to the heavens, a fragrant message and offering. The ritual procedure itself, while varying in its details depending on the god, the occasion, and local custom, generally followed a set pattern performed with solemnity and precision. The chosen animal, ideally unblemished, and appearing to approach the altar willingly, a little nudge, with a barley-baited hand often helped with this divine consent, would be led in a procession, often adorned with ribbons or garlands. Water would be sprinkled on its head to make it not another sign of ascent, and sacred barley grains scattered on it and on the altar. Prayers would be offered, hymns sung. Then the officiant, whether a priest or the head of a household, would perform the central act. For our sleepy journey, we don't need to dwell on the mechanics of this moment, but it was swift and performed with specific traditional cuts. The women present would often raise a ritual cry, the ololaik, a high-pitched, ululating sound that marked the sacredness and emotional intensity of the transition. The most crucial part, from the perspective of the gods' share, was the burning of the thigh bones, and fat creating that aromatic smoke. The rest of the animal was then carefully butchered, cooked, and distributed among the participants in a communal feast either at the sanctuary itself or back in the community. This feasting was not just a good meal, it was a vital part of the ritual, a way of sharing in the sacredness of the offering, reaffirming community bonds and partaking in the blessings sought or received. There's a quirky little tidbit that sometimes, particularly in very local rustic fertility rites for the Veileds, if a sacrificial animal appeared particularly unwilling to approach the altar, say a designated piglet that made a determined and embarrassingly noisy bolt for freedom, just as the priest was clearing his throat for the main prayer, it might be seen as a rather bad omen, or a clear sign that the deity was temporarily not accepting calls, or was perhaps displeased about something. This could lead to a frantic, undignified chase, a hasty search for a more enthusiastic and divinely approved offering, or a lot of nervous priestly consultations about what exactly had upset the divine agricultural department that particular morning. Right piglet number 1 has clearly registered a strong objection. Does anyone have a slightly more compliant and preferably less vocal backup piglet? The barley futures are depending on this. The precise theological understanding behind Greek animal sacrifice, particularly the exact mechanism by which the act was believed to secure divine favor or transfer vitality. Whether it was primarily seen as a gift to feed or please the gods with its aroma, a ritualized release and redirection of potent life force back into the cosmos, a means of communal purification through the symbolic loading of sins onto the victim, or a complex combination of these and other symbolic meanings that undoubtedly varied across different cults, different time periods, and even individual understanding, remains a rich and deeply fascinating area of ongoing scholarly investigation and interpretation. But for the ancient Greek farmer anxiously hoping for rain, for the shepherd praying for healthy lambs, or for the couple yearning for a child, the act of sacrifice performed with due reverence and communal participation was a powerful and deeply ingrained way of actively engaging with the divine forces they believed shaped their world, a plea in blood and smoke for the bounty of life to continue. You have just witnessed the profound and sometimes rather intense communal ritual of animal sacrifice in ancient Greece, an act performed with solemn reverence and an eye towards the subsequent feast, to honor the gods, appease their potential wrath, and earnestly request their life-giving blessings, particularly those of fertility for the land, the livestock, and the human family. This was a very public, very direct way of engaging with the divine. But alongside these grander, more formal ceremonies, the ancient Greeks also possessed a rich, deeply ingrained tradition of folk medicine and magical practice, often utilizing the subtle powers of the natural world, specifically herbs, plants, and what they might have considered magic seeds, in their personal, often quieter quests for fertility and procreation. These were the potions and plants, the herbal brews and carefully gathered roots that whispered of ancient botanical wisdom and hopeful hearts. The ancient Greeks, living in such close communion with the Mediterranean landscape, developed an extensive, if not always scientifically accurate, by our modern pharmacological standards, understanding of the properties of various plants. They knew which herbs could soothe the fever, which could ease pain, which might induce sleep. And crucially for our sleepy exploration tonight, which were believed to hold power over love, desire, and the very wellsprings of human and agricultural fertility. Ancient Greek medical texts, such as those attributed to the school of Hippocrates or later, more comprehensive botanical treatises like Dioscorides' famous De Materia Medica, written in the 1st century CE, but drawing on much older Greek knowledge, describe a wide array of plants believed to influence human fertility. These might be used to promote conception, to aid in childbirth, to regulate female cycles, or to act as potent aphrodisiacs, stirring the very desires that could lead to new life. Imagine yourself an ancient Greek individual, or perhaps a couple earnestly seeking the blessing of a child. You might consult a local rhizotomos, a root cutter or herbalist, often a wise old woman or man, with a deep inherited knowledge of the local flora and its secret virtues. They might prescribe specific herbs to be gathered at particular times, perhaps under a certain phase of the moon or from a specific sacred location, and then prepared in a precise way. This wasn't just about popping a prenatal vitamin. This was about engaging with the living spirit of the plant, respectfully harnessing its inherent magical and medicinal energies. For general malaise, you might be advised to try a nice, soothing chamomile tea, but for ensuring your olive grove was blessed by Demeter and your wife conceived healthy, twins by the next Panathenaic festival, you'd likely need something a bit more specific. Perhaps the rare dew-kissed moon petal of the silver thistle gathered only when Jupiter auspiciously aligned with your local goat herd. And definitely don't forget to recite the 7 secret verses of the thrice blessed fig while you're at it. Specificity, you see, was often key to these ancient recipes for success. One of the most famous and famously potent plants associated with fertility and love magic in the ancient world was the mandrake or mandragora. Its forked root often bears a striking, if somewhat unsettling, resemblance to a human form, which undoubtedly contributed to its mystical reputation. Mandrake was believed to be a powerful aphrodisiac, a promoter of conception, and a key ingredient in many love potions and fertility charms. However, it was also known to be quite toxic if used improperly, possessing strong narcotic and hallucinogenic properties. There's a particularly quirky and rather dramatic tidbit about harvesting mandrake. It was sometimes believed that the plant would emit a horrifying shriek when pulled from the earth. A shriek so terrible it could kill or drive mad anyone who heard it directly. Therefore, a common and rather elaborate, if somewhat apocryphal-sounding method for safely harvesting it involved carefully digging around the root, then tying one end of a rope to the plant and the other end to a dog. The harvester would then retreat to a safe distance, perhaps plugging their ears with beeswax and call or entice the dog, which would then pull the mandrake root from the ground, thereby taking the brunt of its fatal shriek upon itself. One sincerely hopes the dog received very generous treats, a comfy retirement plan, and perhaps some tiny, divinely crafted canine earplugs for its perilous horticultural and acoustical assistance in these matters. Good boy Argos, you've successfully uprooted the screaming doom root of procreation. Here's a slightly singed, but very well-intentioned sausage for your trouble. Other plants held gentler, if still potent, associations. Orchid tubers, particularly from species whose paired tubers resembled male anatomy, often called Satyrian, after the lusty satyrs, were widely believed to be powerful aphrodisiacs and enhancers of male virility. Various seeds and nuts, by their very nature, as the starting points of new life, were also imbued with sympathetic fertility magic. Pine nuts almonds. Sesame seeds and even poppy seeds, though more commonly linked to hypnosis and sleep. Their sheer abundance in a poppy head could also suggest fecundity might be consumed, offered to deities, or incorporated into special fertility-boosting cakes or breads. Eating a pomegranate with its hundreds of jewel-like seeds was a particularly potent act of sympathetic magic for those hoping for numerous offspring, a tradition directly linked to the myth of Persephone and her consumption of pomegranate seeds in the underworld, which bound her to return, thus ensuring the cycle of seasons and agricultural renewal. At least with this particular ritual, you got a delicious and rather healthy snack out of the deal, even if it didn't immediately result in a house full of tiny future philosophers. Aromatic herbs like mint, sacred to Persephone, and sometimes used in the Eleusinian, kike and basil rosemary, and especially myrtle. An evergreen plant, sacred to Aphrodite and a symbol of love and immortality, were frequently used in potions, perfumes, love charms, or simply incorporated into the diet with the belief that they would enhance desire and promote conception. A bridal wreath might be made of myrtle or its fragrant branches used to decorate the marriage chamber. The actual pharmacological efficacy of many of these ancient Greek herbal remedies prescribed specifically for fertility versus the powerful psychological impact of belief in their power, the ritual context in which they were often prepared and consumed, and the undeniable influence of the placebo effect, or indeed, their function primarily as symbolic rather than direct physiological agents, that simply made people feel more hopeful and perhaps more amorous, remains a complex and fascinating area of ongoing investigation for historians of medicine, archaeobotanists, and those who study ancient materia medica. Some plants undoubtedly had real physiological effects, while others likely worked their magic more on the heart and mind. But for the ancient Greek individual or couple carefully brewing an infusion of specific herbs gathered under a benevolent moon, or respectfully consuming magic seeds with an earnest prayer to Aphrodite or Demeter, these were not just idle superstitions. They were active, hopeful engagements with the natural world and its perceived hidden powers, tangible steps taken in their profound and deeply human desire to participate in the great ongoing miracle of life's continuation. Some of these ancient fertility potions and herbal brews sound like they'd either result in the immediate arrival of triplets or just a very, very upset stomach, possibly both simultaneously. A 50-50 chance really in the grand lottery of ancient botanical blessings. You've now journeyed through a fascinating, if sometimes rather perplexing array of ancient Greek practices aimed at coaxing forth the blessings of fertility. You've seen them employ potent herbal brews, whisper ancient incantations, carry protective amulets, participate in communal purifications, and offer solemn animal sacrifices, all in the hope of ensuring that their fields would be fruitful, their livestock would multiply, and their homes would be filled with the laughter of healthy children. But what happened when all these personal efforts, these local rituals, these carefully prepared potions and magic seeds seemed to fail? What if the land remained stubbornly barren, or a marriage distressingly childless despite all their best endeavors? For many ancient Greeks, when faced with such profound and persistent anxieties, particularly those concerning the continuation of their lineage, there was often one further, very significant avenue of recourse, seeking direct divine guidance from one of the great oracles of the Hellenic world. It was time to take their pleas for fertile wombs and bountiful fields to the gods' most trusted, if often rather enigmatic, earthly mouthpieces. In the ancient Greek world, oracles were not just fortune-telling sideshows. They were deeply revered religious institutions, places where mortals believed they could directly communicate with the gods and receive divine pronouncements on matters of grave importance, both public and personal. Supplicants would journey often at great expense and over considerable distances to famous oracular centers like Delphi. Sacred to Apollo or Dodona, the ancient seat of Zeus and Dione, to pose their questions and receive the gods' often cryptic but always significant reply. And among the many pressing personal concerns brought before these divine consultants, questions about childlessness, marriage prospects, and how to appease the gods to ensure healthy offspring were undoubtedly very common. If your own efforts and local rituals hadn't done the trick, perhaps Apollo with his far-seeing prophetic vision, or Zeus, the all-powerful father of gods and men, could offer a solution, a divine diagnosis, or at least a hint about which particular deity you'd accidentally offended and needed to shower with extra nice sacrificial cakes. Imagine yourself an ancient Greek, perhaps a man from a respected family whose marriage has remained childless for several anxious years, or a woman who has suffered miscarriages and now desperately seeks a healthy pregnancy. You've tried all the local remedies, made all the usual offerings, but to no avail. With a heavy heart and perhaps a mixture of hope and trepidation, you decide to undertake the arduous journey to a renowned oracle. A trip to Delphi, for instance, wasn't a casual weekend getaway to consult a mildly eccentric psychic in a pleasantly incense-filled tent. It was a serious pilgrimage involving travel through often rugged terrain, the cost of sacrifices and offerings, and the emotional weight of approaching one of the most sacred sites in your world. You would likely purify yourself through ritual bathing before even entering the sacred precinct or temenos. Once there, you wouldn't just barge in and demand answers. There were protocols to observe. Supplicants journeying to major oracular sites like Delphi or Dodona would typically undergo further purification rituals. Make preliminary sacrifices, often a goat or a sheep, whose entrails might also be examined for omens by the temple priests. And then, after paying a fee, present their carefully and often very precisely phrased question to the priests or priestesses who serve the oracle. Getting a straight yes or no from an oracle, especially about something as complex and fate-driven as having children, was about as likely as convincing Hades to take up Morris dancing and tour the summer festival circuit. Possible in theory if the fates were feeling particularly whimsical, but definitely don't hold your breath or sell tickets just yet. At Delphi, your question would eventually be put to the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo who would enter a trance state supposedly inspired by vapors rising from a chasm in the earth. Though modern geology casts some doubt on this particular detail, the trance itself was very real to the participants. Her utterances, often wild, ecstatic, and highly ambiguous, would then be translated or interpreted by the male priests of the temple into slightly more coherent, though still usually quite cryptic verse or prose. At the ancient oracle of Zeus at Dodona, things were a bit different and perhaps even more charmingly rustic. There, the priest known as the Seloi, who according to some ancient sources rather endearingly slept on the ground and pointedly didn't wash their feet all, to maintain a more profound and earthy connection to the prophetic power of the earth. God would interpret the will of Zeus by listening to the rustling of leaves from his sacred oak tree, or perhaps by observing the flight patterns and cooing of sacred doves that nested there, or even by discerning messages from the sound of bronze cauldrons or wind chimes, striking each other as they hung from the branches. Imagine trying to get clear, actionable advice on your complex family planning situation from a particularly windy day in an ancient oak grove with a flock of rather opinionated divine pigeons, adding thereto drachmas worth. The leaves rustle thusly, my son. It sounds like perhaps try more pomegranates for Hera. Consider adopting a nice sturdy goat for companionship in the meantime, and maybe repaint your front door a more auspicious shade of sky blue. Very insightful, oh mighty Zeus. Thank you ever so much for that crystal clear guidance. The oracular response you received, whether from Delphi's Pythia or Dodona's rustling leaves, was rarely a straightforward prescription for fertility. It wouldn't be, take 2 of these sacred herbs and call me in 9 months. More often, it would be an enigmatic riddle, a conditional prophecy, or a directive to perform a specific, often seemingly unrelated ritual action. The oracle might say something like, "The barren tree shall fruit when the bronze eagle mates with the silver dove under a sky of weeping olives." Right, so, does that mean you need to make more sacrifices to Aphrodite whose sacred birds were doves? Offer something special to Zeus the eagle and perhaps perform a rain-making ceremony for your olive groves? Or is it a metaphor for a specific family alliance that needs to be forged? The priests who had to interpret some of those really obscure oracular pronouncements for the anxious supplicants probably deserved a medal for creative thinking and divinely inspired spin doctoring. Yes, my good man. When Apollo said, "The ox plows not the barren field until the 7th son of the 7th son bathes in the tears of a one-eyed goat," he clearly meant that you should immediately repaint your front door a more cheerful shade of cerulean blue and offer a particularly large and well-marbled portion of your next sacrificial lamb to your slightly neglected Auntie Theodora. Makes perfect sense when you think about it, doesn't it? The degree to which ancient Greek oracular pronouncements concerning these deeply personal matters like infertility were genuinely believed by all supplicants to be infallible divine revelations versus being sometimes recognized even then as shrewd psychological counseling. Cleverly ambiguous statements crafted by worldly wise priests to offer a measure of hope while avoiding specific liability if things didn't pan out or even subtly influenced by political, social, or economic considerations of the sanctuary itself is a complex question that continues to be explored by historians of ancient religion and society. For the desperate individual or couple, however, the word of the oracle, however puzzling, carried immense weight. They would return home pondering its meaning, consulting with family and local seers, and meticulously trying to fulfill any prescribed actions. Sometimes the oracle might instruct them to honor a forgotten local hero or nymph, or to reinstate an ancient neglected fertility rite in their community. Other times it might suggest a pilgrimage to a different sanctuary, or even in more extreme cases, a change of location, a move to a new city or region, deemed more auspicious by the god. The pronouncements, even in their ambiguity, offered a path forward, a sense of divine engagement, and perhaps most importantly, a renewal of hope in their quest for the precious blessing of children, that vital word on wombs from the gods themselves. You have just returned in your mind from a solemn, hopeful pilgrimage to one of ancient Greece's great oracles, perhaps clutching a cryptic, multi-layered pronouncement from Apollo at Delphi, or deciphering the rustling intentions of Zeus's sacred oak at Dodona. These divine consultations, often undertaken after personal remedies and local rituals had failed to bring the desired blessing of fertility, represented a significant investment of time, resources, and emotional energy. But even as you pondered the oracle's words, or perhaps while you awaited your turn to consult the god, there was another very tangible and deeply personal way ancient Greeks sought to communicate their needs and hopes to the divine, particularly in matters of health, well-being, and crucially for our sleepy journey, the profound desire for children, the dedication of votive offerings or anathemata at sacred shrines. And some of these offerings to our modern eyes might seem rather odd, particularly the remarkably direct anatomical representations pleading for or giving thanks for the miracle of fertility. The practice of dedicating votive offerings was a cornerstone of ancient Greek religious piety, a ubiquitous way for individuals to establish a connection with a deity, to make a vow, to implore divine assistance, or to express gratitude for favors received. These offerings could range from the incredibly humble, a simple handmade clay token, a garland of wildflowers, a lock of hair, to the astonishingly lavish, magnificent bronze statues, intricately wrought gold and silver vessels, or even entire small buildings erected within a sanctuary. Sanctuaries dedicated to healing deities like Asclepius, or to those goddesses with strong connections to fertility and childbirth, such as Artemis, Demeter, Aphrodite, and Hera throughout the ancient Greek world, have yielded countless thousands of these anathemata. And among the most common, and for our purposes most telling, are the anatomical votives, representations of specific human body parts, offered by hopeful hearts as direct pleas for divine intervention or as heartfelt tokens of thanks. Imagine yourself stepping into the bustling yet sacred precinct of a healing sanctuary, perhaps one dedicated to Asclepius, or a quieter, more intimate shrine known for its efficacy in matters of childbirth or women's health. As your eyes adjust to the dim, incense-scented interior, or as you wander through the outdoor areas where offerings were displayed, you would see an astonishing array of these anatomical models. If someone had suffered a broken leg and sought healing, they might dedicate a small terracotta or metal model of a leg once they recovered. If their eyes troubled them, a pair of votive eyes. If their ears, then model ears. It was a very direct, very visual form of prayer and gratitude, a way of focusing the god's attention on the specific area of concern. Dear gods of getting specific things done. The offering implicitly stated, "You see this clay model of my rather problematic left knee? That's the bit I'm particularly concerned about today. Please see attached diagram and apply your divine intervention accordingly. Many thanks, and there's a nice sacrificial goat in it for you if it stops aching by next Tuesday." Now, when it came to matters of fertility, these anatomical votives could become even more specific, and to us perhaps surprisingly frank. It was common for individuals or couples hoping to conceive, or for pregnant women praying for a safe delivery, or for those giving thanks for a healthy child to dedicate terracotta or sometimes metal models of human reproductive organs. Yes, you heard that right. Small, often stylized representations of male and female genitalia, of wombs sometimes even shown with a tiny fetus within, or of full breasts lactating milk, would be offered at these shrines. These weren't intended to be crude or shocking in the way our modern culture might sometimes perceive such directness. For the ancient Greeks, these were potent symbols of the very seat of life's creation, offered with deep sincerity and earnest hope. They were a direct, unambiguous appeal to the divine powers that governed procreation. It was like saying, "Dear Aphrodite, or whichever deity is on duty for baby making this afternoon, please make this particular part of me or my spouse work as intended. See attached surprisingly well-fired clay diagram for your divine reference." Beyond these more direct anatomical representations, hopeful parents might also dedicate models of swaddled infants or tiny terracotta cradles, sometimes with an even tinier, barely discernible baby blob nestled inside. These were like hopeful pre-orders to the divine powers, a tangible expression of their deepest yearning. "One healthy baby, please." The offering might whisper, to be delivered in approximately 9 months. Standard divine shipping is perfectly fine, but express celestial delivery would be very much appreciated if it's not too much trouble for your godly schedule. Others giving thanks for a child already born might offer a representation of a healthy baby or a plaque depicting a mother nursing her infant. The materials used for these votives varied. Terracotta, being inexpensive and easy to mold, was by far the most common, allowing people from all walks of life to make such dedications. Wealthier individuals might commission votives in bronze, silver, or even more precious materials, but the sincerity of the offering, not its monetary value, was what truly mattered to the gods. Or so the priest would likely assure you, while perhaps subtly appraising the quality of your donation. Some of these votives were mass-produced or from molds, simple and utilitarian. Others show surprising artistry and individual detail, suggesting they were specially commissioned or perhaps even lovingly crafted by the supplicant themselves or a family member. The precise interpretation of some of the more abstract or unusually stylized anatomical votives found at Greek sanctuaries, whether they represent specific medically recognized conditions of the time, more generalized pleas for well-being in a particular bodily region, purely symbolic representations of a desired outcome like a full or open womb, or even if some of them were mass-produced generic offerings that a hopeful individual could then mentally assign their specific prayer to, remains a complex and often fascinating area of study for archaeologists and historians of ancient religion and medicine. The temple walls and offering tables at these sanctuaries must have looked like a very earnest, sometimes slightly unsettling, and incredibly diverse ancient anatomical museum after a few centuries of these hopeful hearts leaving their tangible pleas. And on your left, a temple guide might say to a new visitor, "We have the rather impressive Hall of Miraculously Mended Kneecaps and surprisingly fertile kidneys, followed by the ever-popular Pavilion of Successfully Conceived Heirs." Sometimes these anatomical votives could be surprisingly specific or even a bit unintentionally comical in their earnest detail. Imagine finding a tiny terracotta model of a pair of particularly robust-looking male calves. Was this offered by an athlete, hoping his future sons would inherit his speedy legs for the Olympic Games? Or perhaps a farmer wanting strong sons to help with the plowing? Or what about a beautifully formed, perfectly ripe ear of barley dedicated alongside a model womb at a shrine to Demeter? This would be a very direct visual linking of agricultural abundance with human fertility, a prayer for both field and family to be fruitful. One wonders how the gods or their busy temple staff kept track of all these very specific, very visual requests. Right? That's the third lovingly crafted terracotta left earlobe this week from the village of Thebes. Are they having an earlobe appreciation festival we weren't informed about, or is someone just being particularly clumsy with their new statement earrings? These odd offerings, these tangible prayers from hopeful hearts provide an incredibly intimate glimpse into the anxieties, the desires, and the deep-seated faith of ancient Greek individuals facing one of life's most fundamental challenges, the wish to create and nurture new life. They are silent, often humble, yet profoundly eloquent testaments to an enduring human hope. You have now wandered through the often enigmatic, sometimes startling, and always deeply human world of ancient Greek fertility rituals, from the solemn pronouncements of oracles to the very personal and direct pleas represented by those curious anatomical votive offerings left at sacred shrines. We've seen how a profound desire for abundance, in their fields and their flocks, and most especially in their families, permeated every level of Greek society and spurred a vast array of religious and magical practices. As our sleepy exploration of these strange ancient customs draws to its gentle conclusion, it's worth taking a final quiet moment to reflect on the enduring human wishes that lay at their heart, and how these ancient desires for life's continuation still find their echoes in our own time, connecting us across the millennia to those hopeful hearts of long ago. The fundamental human preoccupation with fertility, encompassing not just procreation, but also agricultural success, the health of the community, and the overall vibrant continuity of life, is a well-documented theme in the religious beliefs, social customs, and artistic expressions of virtually all human societies, past and present. It reflects a deep-seated biological and cultural imperative, a primal urge to see life flourish and endure. The ancient Greeks, for all the uniqueness of their specific rituals and their particular pantheon of gods, were simply one vibrant thread in this vast, timeless human tapestry of hope and endeavor. Their strange rituals were their culturally specific ways of grappling with life's biggest mysteries and its most cherished blessings. When we look at the core impulses behind their actions, are they really so alien to us? The farmer who left an offering for Demeter before sowing his barley was expressing the same fundamental hope for a good harvest that a modern farmer feels, even if their methods now involve soil science and i.e. GPS-guided tractors, rather than, or perhaps in some quiet corners alongside prayers to an earth goddess. The couple who journeyed to an oracle or dedicated a votive offering in the hope of conceiving a child were driven by the same deep yearning for family that motivates people today, even if our paths might lead us to fertility clinics and complex medical interventions, rather than the Pythia's cryptic pronouncements or a terracotta model of a womb. Whether it's leaving a carefully prepared and possibly rather pungent offering for Demeter's pigs in a sacred pit, or meticulously tracking ovulation cycles with a high-tech app and anxiously Googling foods that boost sperm count at 3 a.m. The underlying anxiety and fervent hope about making babies is pretty timeless, isn't it? The strangeness of ancient Greek fertility rituals from our modern vantage point often lies in their direct, uninhibited symbolism. Those phallic processions, for instance, or the anatomical votives, their blending of what we might separate into religion, magic, and medicine, and their public communal engagement with matters that our society often relegates to the private sphere. But this directness also speaks to a worldview where the body nature and the divine were not seen as separate and distinct, but as deeply interconnected, where a ritual action performed with sincere intent in one realm could have a powerful, tangible effect in another. Their rituals were a way of actively participating in the cosmic drama of creation and renewal. It's also rather amusing, and perhaps a little humbling, to consider what aspects of our own modern rituals surrounding fertility, birth, and family might seem wonderfully strange or perplexing to an ancient Greek observer if they were to be suddenly transported to our time. Imagine trying to explain a modern baby shower with its mountains of pastel-colored gifts, its sometimes bizarre party games, and its often very public celebration of an impending birth to someone whose own culture approached such matters with a host of apotropaic charms to ward off evil spirits and quiet prayers to Artemis or Hera. Or picture their reaction to a gender reveal party with its exploding cannons of pink or blue-colored smoke. So, you set off a small, brightly colored, and rather smoky explosion to announce the future potential fertility of your yet-to-be-determined offspring's gender identity. Fascinating? Does this particular smoky display also appease the local cloud nymphs or ensure the child will have a good olive harvest in later life? Our strange is simply their normal but and vice versa. Even today in our supposedly secular and scientific age, many people still carry lucky charms for various purposes, perhaps for an exam, a job interview, or even when trying to conceive. People still follow old wives' tales about certain foods or actions that might improve their chances of having a healthy baby, or hang a horseshoe over a barn door for good luck and abundance. These are often gentle modern echoes of the same kind of sympathetic magic and hopeful ritual that our ancient Greek friends were practicing with their carefully knotted amulets, their potent herbal brews, and their earnest offerings at crossroads shrines. It's rather charming to think that an ancient Greek, if they were somehow transported to a modern supermarket or garden center, might look at a brightly colored glossy seed packet with its enticing picture of a giant perfect tomato and an impressive yield guarantee printed on the back, and see it not just as a commercial product, but as a very powerful, if rather flat and strangely crinkly fertility amulet. They've captured the very soul of tomato abundance on this tiny piece of, what is this shiny, unterrible leaf? The precise efficacy of many ancient Greek fertility rituals in a purely material, scientific sense is of course open to debate and often impossible to prove. The actual pharmacological effects of many of their herbal remedies versus the powerful psychological impact of belief, the ritual context and the ever-present placebo effect or their function, primarily as symbolic rather than direct physiological agents, is a complex area. But what is undeniable is the profound human need. These rituals address the need for hope, for a sense of agency in the face of life's uncertainties, for communal support, and for a meaningful connection to the forces perceived to govern existence. In a world without modern medicine or scientific agriculture, these rituals provided a framework for action, a way to channel anxiety into purposeful behavior, and a shared cultural language for expressing life's most fundamental desires. How contemporary society should ethically engage with and represent these ancient, often deeply personal and culturally specific fertility rituals, particularly those that might seem strange or even offensive by our modern standards of decorum or scientific understanding. Avoiding both uncritical romanticization and ethnocentric judgment, while still trying to understand and convey their profound human meaning and the context in which they arose, is a continuous and important challenge for historians, museum curators, archaeologists, and educators alike. Their rituals, however odd some might appear to us now, were born from a deep reverence for the cycles of nature, a powerful belief in the interconnectedness of all things, and an enduring, hopeful heart. At the core of every buried piglet, every phallic parade, every whispered incantation, and every tiny votive offering was a very human plea. Please let there be more life, more joy, more harvests, more children to continue our story. And that perhaps is a wish that still echoes in its own way in every hopeful human heart today. Even if our methods now involve significantly fewer sacrificed goats and a great deal more peer-reviewed scientific studies. The ancient desires, it seems, leave timeless, deeply resonant echoes. And so as the last whispers of these ancient Greek fertility rituals fade into the quiet of your mind, as the images of torchlit processions, sacred groves, and hopeful offerings at ancient shrines begin to soften and dissolve, let the profound human desire for life and continuity that fueled them all bring a sense of gentle peace. The specific forms of their devotion may seem distant and strange, but the underlying hopes, the yearning for abundance, for family, for the flourishing of the world around them, these are threads that connect us across the vast expanse of time. The ancient Greeks, in their own unique and often wonderfully peculiar ways, were simply seeking to nurture the very essence of existence. Let the thought of their earnest, hopeful hearts be a soothing balm as you drift further into relaxation. The need to perform complex rites to decipher cryptic oracles or to appease capricious deities can now recede. The night offers its own simple, profound blessing, the gift of rest, of renewal, of quietude. May your own journey into sleep be peaceful and untroubled as your mind gently lets go of the day and embraces the calm, restorative darkness. The ancient world, with all its strange and sacred whispers, now slumbers, and so too can you.